We'll go for 5 minutes late. I'm going to call the meeting to order at 6:35, 2 minutes before my usual time. Everyone is here. Nope.
Leslie's talking away.
Leslie's talking to.
Leslie. Okay, let's just.
Can everyone please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, the first item on our agenda this evening is an executive session for the discussion of pending litigation. Can I have a motion to go into executive session, please?
So move.
Seconded.
Okay.
So we have a motion moved by Ms. Tarkenton, seconded by Mr. Raymer.
Like Beth.
Right?
No, that's all right.
Mr. Raymer, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Please say aye. We need a 2/3 vote, so all in favor of moving into executive session?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any objection? 12-0-0. The next item on our agenda this evening is request for budget adjustments. We have 2 routine items detailed on the meeting agenda. Are there any objections to taking up these items as routine? Hearing none, Ms. Crumick, BET Clerk, can you please move these routine items?
Be happy to. We'll move PD 2 from the police in the amount of $68,697. This is an approval to use DUI enforcement program. And then HD 3 from the Health Department in the amount of $43,314 for the approval to use a PHEP grant.
Is there a second?
Seconded.
Seconded by Mr. Raymer. Ms. Moriarty, can you please give the Budget Committee report?
Yes, the Budget Committee took these items up at our meeting last week. First, the Police Department item, we were presented the grant request by Traffic Sergeant Pat Smith. This is a program which we've received annually. It's administered by the State Department of Transportation. The funds are used for overtime and fringe benefit costs associated with enforcement efforts against DUI, and these are supplemental to the department's regular patrol activities. The goal, of course, is to decrease the number of crashes, injuries, and fatalities through increased visibility enforcement efforts. The vote at the Budget Committee was 4-0-0 to recommend approval. The Health Department grant approval to use the Public Health Emergency Preparedness Grant through its fiduciary agent, Yale New Haven Health Systems Corps. That was presented to us by the town's Director of Health, Caroline Baisley. The plan here is to use the funds to cover the expenses of a part-time emergency preparedness coordinator who would be responsible for maintaining all the public health emergency planning activities. The vote at the Budget Committee on this item was also 4-0-0 to recommend approval.
Thank you. Is there any questions or discussion on these 2 items? Hearing none, I'm going to call for a vote. All in favor, please say aye and raise your hands.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Those items have carried 12-0-0. Okay. The next item on our agenda is the Assessor's Report. Ms. Elliott, thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Madam Chairman and fellow members of the BET. Tonight I would like to present the Assessor's Report for October 2018. In addition to my report, I've also included my operational plan, which was submitted to the Board of Selectmen last week. I think it's also been published with all the others. My capital plan, which is also submitted to the Board of Selectmen, that has not changed over the last 2 years. And then also my office budget. That is due in November 15th, I believe. And all of these have been reviewed by the liaisons, Ms. Tarkington and Mr. Raymer. Okay. In addition, I apologize, I have to hand out a corrected chart showing the pending court cases. There is an error in the under the September 18th column under the 2015 grand list. I forgot to update the fair market values. You'll see on this corrected sheet that in 2015, between September of 2018 and October 2018, we have not settled any of those cases. Okay, differs from what's in your handout. Next month, in the November meeting, I shall introduce the new assistant assessor. He's been with us for about a little over a month and a half or so. So far, so good. I'll introduce him when I come before you next November. Any questions for me this evening? Yes.
I noticed in your report that the 2012
Yes.
litigation was settled. Could you, I know that you share that with the liaisons, but can you share the results of that litigation with us?
Sure. The 2012 litigation was basically two homes. It was a major home and a smaller adjacent guest cottage up in Conyers Farm. We ultimately settled. We had the value originally assessed, 100% value at roughly $17.7 million. For the 2012 through the 2014 grand list, we settled at $15.5 million. On the 2015 forward, we settled at $14,500,000. So we did have a bit of a reduction, but not too bad. The second parcel, there was a significant change, but since the litigation, they have subsequently torn down one of the homes and rebuilt another one. So the litigation really is a moot point at this point going forward because there is a totally new structure on this property. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So we receive, as part of the assessor's report, her budget request, and I'm sure everybody understands that we accept the report, we accept the budget request. It is not an assurance, of course, from this board that that's the budget as it will be approved in March by the full BET. It may not be the budget, rather, sorry.
But I would like to point out that, that this budget does show actual reduction in the total operating costs year over year from the current fiscal year to next year of 1.88%, which is setting a pattern that I hope other departments will follow.
Yes, so just to clarify, so in voting to accept the report, we're accepting her report, but we're not voting on the budget as it's presented.
Not approving the budget.
Not
for the-
approving, it's just for information only.
For your review.
Okay. So we have a motion to accept the assessor's report made by Ms. Tarkington, seconded by Mr. Raymer. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? That item is carried, 12-0-0. Thank you very much. The next item is the Comptroller's report. Mr. Mynarski, can you join us?
Good evening, Madam Chair, BET members. Starting on page 1, the auditors have actually concluded their field work, and good news to report, we're probably 1 to 2 months ahead of last year. Some of the testing they were doing in late December has all been completed, and we're starting to work on the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. In the second topic below the auditors, we have a replacement for the revenue clerk starting Monday. As I reported last month, we are getting an employee from the tax collector's office, which leaves a void or a hole in the tax collector's personnel.
Do you feel no remorse?
He's not here. I don't know where he went. I think he's mad at me. Yeah. The accounts payable supervisor took the chief accountant's job, as I reported last month. She's very capable, CPA, University of Pennsylvania. We advertised that a week ago. It's a 2-week window, and I heard that 50 people applied in the first week.
Great.
One internal. They usually have preference. Howard. So we...
You just missed it, Howard.
I told him that Selvin starting Monday, and you're mad at me.
And I asked whether or not he feels any remorse of having stolen the employee.
Okay, we're going to let Mr. Mynarski.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the other the bank reconciliation clerk starts Monday, that's Elvin, and then the revenue clerk, we're in the process of testing. And as I stated before, with the chief accountant leaving, there's a number of us, at least 5 of us, that are pitching in wearing 2 hats, especially at the timing of the year-end close. Wanted to follow up, and I'll open this up to questions, just a couple more comments. On page 5, I noted that I was not going to submit the budget. I think it was page 5. The budget was not going to be given to you until next month. One of the things we're working on, because we have so many vacancies, we're hiring at lower amounts of money. So at a minimum, we'll come at 0 or with a decrease once we know what the salaries are for next year. And then finally, it's on page 5. The insurance broker RFP has been concluded. We have a long-standing arrangement with the Franklin Company, the former broker. We'll be making a change. Don't want to publicly announce it. We talked about it at the audit committee. We just need to check out a reference or 2 and make sure that the insurance requirements are met. And then the liability auto property, we made a change there from CIRMA, Connecticut Interlocal Risk Management Agency. That's for third-party administration of liability, auto, and property. And finally, Howard notified me in the page 6. There's actually a misstatement in there in the second paragraph under cash report, where the tax collector added the microline for all portions of the bill in July. It was done only for property taxes, not auto. That's incorrect. Actually, it was done for both. So I'll print a retraction in next month's controller's report, because I just found that out today. Any questions?
Okay. Hearing no questions from Mr. Menarski, can I have a motion to accept the Comptroller's report? Moved by Ms. Tarkington. Seconded by Mr. Raymer. All in favor, please say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? That item has carried 12-0-0. Thank you, Mr. Menarski. Okay. The next item on our agenda is the Treasurer's Report showing investment portfolio activity for the month of September 2018. Are there any questions on the Treasurer? Mr. Menarski.
No one ever asks a question on the Treasurer's report, but I want to offer something, especially since it came up. Karen Fosiolatis brought it up. Wayne mentioned it in executive session. If you have it in front of you, I want to draw your attention down to the risk fund.
Yes.
You see where it's $1,477,000?
Yes.
It doesn't have the $500,000 for the current year. At the rate you're going, you are going to run out of money this year, this fiscal year, not calendar year. You just heard that we'd have to pay $900 and something thousand for the Willauer case. We're about to encumber. There's another case that we have to encumber $250,000. You have the Collins case. The Palos case probably will go into the next fiscal year. You don't have to do anything tonight, but Roland and I were talking about how this fund came about and what happens when we have to default to the general fund to start paying off litigation. And the question came up. This is informational only right now. We're in the process of doing research. The RTM doesn't traditionally vote on expenditures out of the risk fund, although they contribute through the claims committee. There's 3 pieces. There's the selectmen, there's the claims committee, the law committee, and BET. So this will have to be addressed this year as far as if we run out of money before June 30th, procedurally, how are we going to go? One option could be a transfer from the general fund, say $5 million, or we can just simply default to the general fund. Hypothetically, let's say that we hit 0 and we have a case that's $500,000, we only have $200 left, we have to split it, we use the $200 and then potentially the general fund. So this is informational only at this point, but it's going to come up during this fiscal year.
If we do pay out of the general fund, would that would require RTM approval then, or would it be just? I mean, how procedurally would that work?
That's the question Roland and I had. We we've never had this situation. I think we've debated it back and forth. It appears that if you appropriate from the general fund, it definitely has to come, the RTM has to be involved. But what I would probably prefer is a transfer and replenish it. You heard Wayne, he's working on the auditor's letter to Mr. Mason's question. Let's see what's out there, and then I would ask for a transfer to go from the general fund over to the risk fund.
No.
Yes, but but then again, if that's the case, we don't transfers.
The transfers don't generally go to the RTM.
That's correct. Yeah. Interfund.
I believe.
Yeah. Either way, we need further research, but this is a substantial topic, and we'll come back to you probably in the next month or two. This fund has to be replenished in light of what's happening and what's going to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you for the update, Pete. 1 second, Mike. And if you could come forward with a recommendation, what your recommended course of action to deal with this issue, assuming that we do in fact face a potential shortfall, that we'd appreciate that. Mr. Mason.
A couple new questions have come up. I don't like it because I don't have the answers for them. I would say, first of all, the RTM does spend out of the risk fund. They have a claims committee that authorizes on behalf of the full RTM, just like we do. So I think that's accurate. The real question is going to be is that we've had settlements. Do we have to appropriate that expenditure for a settlement? Because we have not. And the answer to the putting the money back in a risk fund, I think, is very clear. It's in fixed charges. You have uncommitted fund balance that you would just make a transfer. We would have to approve it, but I'm just saying that would be the answer there.
By the way,
Mike,
Wait,
yeah, I'm sorry.
are you finished?
Yeah, I just wish I had the answers to those questions.
Ms. Crumick, I don't know whether you remember, I believe that question was asked
Yeah, I was just
at the
gonna
law
say that.
committee. Ms. Vasiludis, if either one of you
Yeah,
want to
I mean,
respond.
we did ask that question of Mr. Fox, and any judgment is paid out of the risk fund. We do not have to approve it. If it's a settlement, this was not a settlement, this was a judgment, then we would have to approve it.
Really? We don't have to approve an appropriation if it's a judgment that orders it of us.
According to Mr. Fox, no, they just pay it out of the risk fund. We do not have to approve that.
I don't think I agree with that either.
That was the legal
Well,
advice we
We are
got.
not going to debate here the merits of the legal advice that we've been given. Mr. Mason, did you have other questions?
No, but there definitely needs to be follow-up.
Yes. Ms. Moriarty?
Just to raise one point, it doesn't help us for fiscal 19, but as we move forward and think about whether this is an exposure in fiscal 20 or beyond, is this something we might want a resolution in the budget about for the ability to use funds out of the general fund to pay litigation settlements or lawsuits?
Yeah.
Ms. Crumick?
I suppose the good news is we didn't have to ask this question very often, but I think the law committee could certainly take it up and go into a little bit more detail for the future.
Okay, agreed.
Thank you. Okay, so the comptroller's report,
Madam Chair?
the treasurer's report, right? We were on the treasurer's report. Mr. Raymer, did you want to add something before we?
I'm sorry. But it ties into Mr. Mason's question. I mean, I heard the advice. If you don't act and the information that we received was incorrect, we will have failed to have appropriated the $900,000 in payment of the judgment. I don't see the harm in our entertaining a motion and approving the appropriation. It will avoid our having to meet again to be able to make the remittance if the advice we've received was misunderstood and therefore incorrect.
Oh, thank you for your suggestion, Mr. Raymer. Are you offering a motion? I don't think we know the exact number. We have not been asked
It might be-
to make a motion, and the advice that we were given by our town council it
But the
was
advice
that
wasn't
we-
given to us. It was given to one of our committees. We didn't hear that advice directly from the town attorney. I'm not sure that the minutes don't reflect the figure that Attorney Ahmad had said is the amount of our remittance, 900 some odd thousand. Kathy, do you have that figure perchance? No.
I do. It was 942,207. Okay,
I don't think we have it.
we should pick the higher amount
I
then.
mean, whatever you want. It just seems smart to me to make the motion.
So you have to add something to the agenda first.
I think
No,
it's,
the item is before us, so
I think it's premature. I think the attorneys have said 30 to 60 days to wrap it up.
all right.
We're going to have time at the
Okay.
next meeting if we
Okay.
have to.
Okay, all right. Maybe we could ask the controller to just confirm that no motion is required, or that a motion is required, an appropriation is required or not required, so we know what we're doing at the next meeting.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marsky. Was there anything else you wanted to raise on the treasurer's report?
Tonight.
Thank you.
Can I just, before we go on, I'm sorry,
Yes,
just
Ms.
to clarify
Vasiliotis.
that the question is if we receive a judgment, not a settlement, because there is a difference, and that was the difference that he opined on.
Well, actually, for what it's worth.
Mr. Raymer, would you like to be recognized?
Yes, I'm sorry. I would like to
Yes,
be recognized.
Mr. Raymer.
It's a settlement, not a judgment, that we're paying. Right?
I would say it would be a judgment that was reduced by agreement, but, I will defer to whatever Wayne Fox says
Okay,
at
me
this
too.
point.
Okay. Any other comments on the treasurer's report? Then I will note that we have received it, and it will be, that the BEC has received the report. So then the next item on our agenda is a report from our standing committees. Mr. Weisbrod, can you please give the audit committee report?
Yes, we've had a number of audit committee meetings. The one action that we've taken is to adopt the forensic report on the parking matter, and that's been accepted and will be, or has already been, posted on the town's website. In addition to that, we've had discussions about the Board of Education capital process. I will defer any further comments until the item is raised under the new business heading, which will be later in the agenda. With regard to the Investment Advisory Committee, we met, and the Investment Advisory Committee voted 3-0. Mr. Turner was not present, although if he were present, he would have voted in favor to accept the subcustodial arrangement as proposed and an amendment to the asset management plan with Newbecker Berman, establishing Fidelity as the subcustodian under the plan. Because further discussion and a workshop to help understand some of the open questions that remain on the part of members of the BET, we will recommend that the item that's in the new business section be continued to the next meeting of the BET. That's my update.
Thank you, Mr. Weisbrod. You jumped ahead and gave him both the audit and investment advisory, but I do appreciate that. Are there any questions on either the audit committee or the investment advisory committee reports? Okay. We have no BET liaison reports this evening and no special project team reports. We do have one item of old business, which is the 2019 BET and BET committee calendar, which you've now seen a couple of meetings in a row. We had added some law committee meetings to the version that's in your packet, and there was a question regarding the timing of the BET meetings with respect to the RTM meetings. There are a number of months where the RTM meetings occur quite early in the cycle, and there was a question as to whether we would shift our BET meetings to accommodate the RTM meetings, and I think it ends up being not feasible in terms of our timing and committee work and their timing. And so, as needed on a case-by-case basis, we may have to develop a workaround, and we'll do that as a case-by-case. I'd like to have a motion to accept the 2019 calendar. Okay, moved by Ms. Tarkington, seconded by Mr. Raymer. Any discussion?
Can I?
Yes, Ms. Moriarty.
Just one comment, only because we had the same situation in 2018, which I should note had more meetings after the RTM than the 2019 calendar. However, we do have, the January meeting meets the same night as the RTM, and we currently have it timed to start at would overlap. I know that when we had that occasion earlier this year, we started the BET meeting earlier so that we would conclude our business before the 8 p.m. RTM start. I don't think we need to decide that change tonight. I just raised that to be considered.
There were some other requests relating to the audit committee meetings that we still haven't concluded on. We will discuss those at the next audit committee meeting when we're all present and resolve those dates.
This is not as you all know from our numerous changes, it's not fixed in stone, and individual committees can work with their members, but we do try to have some level of consistency so people can plan around our calendar, and so I do appreciate, I know it's very difficult to plan a year and a half in advance, and now we understand what the capital planning process is like. This is just meetings. But individual committees, and I will, if you could hold the afternoon of January 22nd, we'll canvass and see whether people can make an earlier meeting work. We have the calendar has been moved by Ms. Tarkington, seconded by Mr. Raymer. All in favor of accepting this calendar, please say aye and raise your hand. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? That item has carried 12-0-0. Which brings us to the new business items on our agenda, which is arguably, I would guess, what has drawn a few members in the audience. The first item on our new business agenda are budget guidelines. The Budget Committee met yesterday morning and approved the budget guidelines, included with the meeting materials and distributed yesterday by email. Ms. Moriarty, Budget Committee Chair, can you please move these guidelines and provide the Budget Committee report?
Yes, I'd like to move approval of the fiscal 20 budget guidelines.
Okay, the fiscal 20 budget guidelines as distributed by email and as you find in front of you have been moved by Ms. Moriarty and seconded by Ms. Tarkington.
So I'll start with the punchline. The Budget Committee voted 3-0-1. Ms. Tarkington abstained to approve the draft guidelines that are presented to you tonight. Maybe I didn't indicate it here last month. So the background in preparing these guidelines, we will have a more difficult budget year than we did for creating the fiscal 19 budget. We know the forecasts are for health care expenses. They increased. The premiums increased 8% as of July 1 in 2018. We're projecting they might be 9% increase in July 1, 2019, which would require a 10.1% increase in the health budget to budget. The pension contribution is also increasing $1.76 million, or 8%. And we know that this is the third year of the GEA contract, which was an arbitrated contract that had very uneven annual GWI and step increases, and the increase in the GEA salaries is estimated to be 3.6% for the next fiscal year. For the past 2 years, the town has benefited from favorable changes in both health care and pension, and thus we are in a different situation for next year. These budget guidelines place an even greater focus on limiting the growth in the budget. The guidelines presented have the following key stipulations, or key requests, I should say, of both the town and the schools' budgets as they prepare them. The target mill rate increase of 2.25% to 3.25%. The town aggregate budget is requested to increase no more than 1% over fiscal 19 budget. The Board of Ed budget is requested to increase no more than 2% over the fiscal 19 budget. All departments are also being asked to prepare to be able to discuss an additional 1% cut on their budgets and to talk about it in terms of the impact on their services, how it would impact residents, how it impacts their staff. All departments have been asked to provide a list of the cost containment projects that we've been talking about over the past several years, and many have implemented. They're small changes, some are larger changes, but we would like to see an aggregate list of the work that our departments have done, are budgeting to do, or can even think about proposing for out years. And we've also know that we're at a point looking forward beyond fiscal 20. The trend in healthcare is not going to change, and so we'll be in this kind of situation in future years as well, which means that we do need to think about ideas for changing the way we deliver our services or changing the amount of services, but to have changes, either operational, structural changes, or technology projects which would impact the cost structure or the efficiency of our town operations. These kinds of ideas are going to be multi-year. They may cross departments. They often might require upfront investment before we start seeing the savings, but I think as a body, we would be interested and willing to listen to those to be able to make judgments on the best way to move forward for the town. On the capital side, our focus in these guidelines talks about completing open capital appropriations. We're asking the departments to come in to talk about the status of each open appropriation and the projection to fill it, the time it will take to complete the project as well, because we'll be considering new capital appropriations in terms of our ability to actually get started and move forward. Remediation projects we've asked to prioritize. Infrastructure projects should be prioritized. And we have also included the concept of public and private partnerships as a vehicle to pursue additional investment. The way the guidelines are presented, Exhibit 1, which is the financial chart that shows the budget levels and the mill rate calculation, does not show what we think the fiscal year 20 budget is going to look like when we complete our work by the end of March. Instead, it shows what the budget would be if we continue our staffing levels, our services as are currently delivered, and we just inflate the cost to cover the new staffing contracts and other inflation that might hit operating expenses. So it includes the contract settlements that we know about and an estimate assumption of 2% for the unresolved contracts. It includes a 2% increase in all other expenses. It assumes no increase in revenues, and it assumes an estimated increase in the grand list of 0.2%. During the Budget Committee discussions, we did note that several contracts were just approved by the RTM last evening and asked for the impact on those. The numbers were run yesterday during the day by Roland Geiger, our budget director, and they're not substantial changes to the numbers, so we're not recommending any changes to Exhibit 1 during this meeting. So as I said, the Budget Committee voted 3-0-1 to approve the guidelines as presented to you this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Moriarty. The Budget Committee has been working on these guidelines for about how long, and how many meetings did you have to discuss these guidelines?
As a committee, we discussed these at 3 different meetings, our meeting in September, and then our regular meeting last week, and we held a special meeting yesterday morning to complete our work. As far as the drafting of the guidelines and the background guidelines to get them to our September meeting, probably work did start in August to get that done.
Thank you. So it sounds like roughly 2 months of work and many conversations, both at the committee level and individually, to reach the guidelines that we have in front of us. I want to thank the members of the Budget Committee and all of the members of the BET who I know provided input through their respective delegates to the Budget Committee for all their hard work in capturing the ideas. As Ms. Moriarty said, this is going to be a more difficult year for the town, and the guidelines set an expectation level as well. In drafting the guidelines, it is important to note that that this draft represents, it seems, what you predict will happen, and does not represent just pure rhetoric about likely outcomes should any number of alternative situations come up. In order to provide the people responding to the guidelines a more reliable focus on what we're expected to look at. I will open this up for discussion. I'd like to remind members that over this 2-month period, they had ample opportunity to convey comments and through their Budget Committee members, and I did ask that we not redraft or attempt to redraft on the floor of the BET. That does a disservice to members who are trying to follow the discussion on substantive issues and not on wordsmithing. Thank you. Anyone would like to comment? Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, I think it's been the Budget Committee guideline process has been a good process. I think that each of the committee members have submitted information and their ideas and thoughts, and Ms. Moriarty has done a great job in trying to incorporate, at least at the Budget Committee level, the comments provided, obviously with some judgments that a chairman makes. I would like to put a motion forth to amend these budget guidelines to change in the summary of guidelines, and I guess later in this, the property tax increase in the range of 2% rather than 2.25%, again reflecting something that I put forth within the Budget Committee and reflecting the current inflation rate for our area. Recognizing that this will be hard to achieve, there's no question about that, but that still trying to bring in our budget at the inflation rate, I think is, something that we should consider for our taxpayers. I'd like to add that whether this is included or not, and I hope it will be, that we will all work together, I expect, to bring in the best budget for the residents of Greenwich, whatever that tax level might be.
Okay, so we have a motion by Ms. Tarkington to amend the budget guidelines on the floor to reflect a range of mill rate increase starting at 2.0%, ranging to 3.25%, seconded by Mr. Mason. Is there discussion on this motion? Ms. Moriarty.
So this motion was discussed at the building committee. Sorry, I'm working at Ms. Tarkington. We work together on a building committee. At the Budget Committee, the motion was made. It was voted 2-2 at the committee with Ms. Tarkington and Mr. Mason in favor, and Mr. Raymer and myself not in favor. And the reasons that I didn't support it then and I won't support it tonight is I think our guidelines should reflect what we believe is a reasonable outcome for our budget deliberations. And the September draft that the Budget Committee discussed had a much wider mill rate increase, going all the way up to 3.5 or 3.75, if I remember correctly. And in our discussions, we talked about needing to try and be as to reflect what we really want to have happen in this budget process, and whether we can get there with the trade-offs that may need to be made. So the upper end of the limit was reduced. I think at the lower end, as I reflected on that and as we discussed in our committee, the 2% is going, I'm not going to say we can't reach it. We don't know. We don't have the information, but it's going to be so difficult, given what we know of where we're starting at a 4.46%, without the same level of conservatism we have had in past budgets. We increased our revenue estimates in the current budget. We lowered operating expense increases in the current budget. So we're not expecting to have as much room for maneuvering in fiscal '20, and therefore I don't think it's wise to put out the number of 2.0. I would believe we should keep the bottom end of the range still at 2.25%.
Mr. Mason.
So in Budget Committee, one of our members said if we could get below the 2.25, they'd be more than happy to go there if that was possible. I thought that was encouraging. I think members of the Budget Committee worked towards a consensus to find a range that we thought was, yes, realistic for the challenges that we see today. I see no negative impact by going to 2. If a revenue returns for some reason that we've lost, and we've lost a lot of them in the last 3 or 4 years, if a revenue returned, we would do what with that revenue? I would think we would apply that revenue to the benefit of the taxpayers. So there's no negative impact by doing this. There's just simply, it doesn't have a negative impact. And I think from consensus building, I think one of our members had an original motion or original concept idea of a range of 2 to 4%. So that's the same 2 as this 2, I think. So I don't see a negative impact to this change.
Mr. Raymer.
So as the person who in fact had said between 2 and 4%, I note that 2 to 4% was a figure that we used for almost a decade, not all that long ago. A part of what happened, and I should add, on the same tone as Mr. Mason had spoken, that I then had suggested that perhaps the range could be 2.25 to 3.25 as a middle ground on which various people of various viewpoints could come together. And this range was put into the guidelines as they were approved yesterday with that idea of compromise in mind. In my own heart of hearts, I rather still would have said the 2 to 4%. I'm not making that motion to amend today. The point is that you want to be communicating to the departments, communicating to the town at large, as a matter of fact, a reasonable expectation, and to have an artificially low figure at the end of the range, 2%, 1%, even 0%, whatever it is, only communicates something which you think today is actually quite unlikely to be achieved. Indeed, for us to be able to move from 3.25 down to 2% would take almost $10 million worth of cuts, if my math is correct, from the programs as they exist today. And that's a very large number. Unless people are prepared to speculate where indeed they would propose to take $10 million worth of cuts, I think it's irresponsible to put the lower end of the range at figures that are not honestly reflective back to the town. But I would be one of those people where, if given return of revenues and the like, I could achieve a 2% mill rate increase, I'd be more than thrilled to bring in a budget at that level. I'm only resisting it on this occasion because I think from the limited facts as we know them today, and today's at a very early point, that we're not likely to be able to achieve that. And so I, for one, will be voting to keep the range at 2.25 to 3.25.
Ms. Tarkington.
I just have one comment on Mr. Raymer's 2 to 4%. It is true that in past years, this board did use a range of 2 to 4%, but it was in a much higher inflation environment. And we've been coming out of an environment where inflation was, basically flat to slightly above. And I think that, again, our range should be reflective of the economy and that what our residents can afford to pay. And the other thing I think is very important is it's, I think, becoming clear to many people that values in the back and mid-country just aren't what they were at the time of our last revaluation, and there'll be a shift. And so the more that we all can work together to achieve lower mill rate increases, just helps our residents because it creates a lower base for future increases.
Okay, any further discussion on this motion? Okay. I'm going to call, since not everybody raises their hands, I'm going to call for a name vote on this. I'm going to start with Ms. Vasiliotis. Okay, Mr. Turner? No. Ms. Tarkington?
Yes.
Mr. Raymer?
No.
Ms. Crumick?
No.
Ms. Moriarty?
No.
Mr. Mason?
Yes.
Mr. Drake?
Yes.
Mr. Weisbrod?
No.
Ms. Hess?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Hughes? Okay, and I am also a no. That is a 6-6 vote. I'm going to, that motion has failed. Okay. Post-traumatic stress from the budget meeting, actually, with the votes. Mr. Drake?
I'd like to propose a modification. I think it's in front of you. You have this on paper to clarify the last sentence, which really means increasing the cost of labor settlements, not increasing the number of labor settlement.
If you could identify where on the budget guidelines that are before us.
Paragraph 1. Hold it.
Sorry. Under current conditions.
Under
paragraph
current
two.
conditions.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, this is Mr. Drake's motion. Mr. Drake, if you could identify where on the budget guidelines that we're considering this
The
evening.
middle of page 2.
Okay, on the middle of page
Thank-
2, can you be specific
About
about?
where the D in draft is.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Are you looking at that?
Can I clarify for you? It's the second paragraph on page 2.
Increasing the cost. Okay, so this is in a Scribner's error. I neglected to mention in the beginning, and as I said in my email, there are a couple of places where there are Scribner's errors. In some places, the use of property tax increase was used interchangeably with mill rate increase, and, I'm going to take, well, we have a motion on the floor, so I'll come back to that, but I had asked for Scribner's errors to be identified so that we could, adopt it first. So Mr. Drake has proposed to add language,
3
The
words,
cost
the
of-
cost of. Yep.
labor, right before labor settlements on the second full paragraph on page 2, which is in the middle of the page, the last line. Is there a second for this motion? Seconded by Mr. Mason. This is in the form of a Scribner's error. I'm going to just take a voice vote on
Sorry, could you just clarify the change, because I'm still not understanding.
Drake Mason. Is everyone, other than Mr. Raymer, clear on the change? I want to make sure we all know what we're voting on. No, okay. This is exactly why I don't want to do drafting changes at the BET. But
Didn't we provide this? Pardon me.
on page 2, I'm going to try to clarify it. On page 2, in the second full paragraph, the last line of that paragraph, there's been a motion made by Mr. Drake, seconded by Mr. Mason, to add 3 words, the cost of, in between the 2 words, increasing and labor, so that the sentence would read, inflation is increasing with the CPIU for all urban consumers for New York, Newark, Jersey City for the 12 months ending September 2018 of 2%, which will also put pressure on the budget by reducing purchasing power and increasing the cost of labor settlements. Does everyone understand what we're voting on?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to call for a voice vote on this item, if you could say aye and raise your hand. All in favor of this motion, please say aye and raise your hand. Aye. Okay. Okay. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Tony, I didn't see your hand. Are you? I'm an aye. You're an aye. Okay. That's why I had a voice vote. 12-0-0. That, look, in the spirit of cooperation, 12-0-0, we've agreed. Okay, that motion has carried. Mr. Deuce.
Okay, thank you. I also like to express my appreciation for the good work done by Ms. Moriarty and her colleagues on the Budget Committee. Very impressive turnaround in such a short time and during a very busy period. I want to talk about the next paragraph in the draft guidelines, the one that begins with Greenwich remains fiscally healthy. I am concerned that given that we're going to be entering a very difficult period, budget period, that this paragraph kind of sets the wrong tone. It's kind of cross purposes of what we're asking the various department heads to do here going forward the next few months. And in essence, it's not helpful. It may be true, but I don't think it's helpful to our task here. And what I had circulated, which actually just to confirm, I assume a copy of this was circulated to all members of the BET before tonight's meeting.
At 4 o'clock.
Okay, well, you guys are good.
When we were
You guys are good.
on our way to the audit committee meeting.
Well, my initial reaction was just to delete the paragraph, although I ultimately decided to take out, half a dozen of the attributes and just list the three key ones, which being the low mill rate, the high tax base, and the low amount of debt. If I can read what I wrote, but if people have on their iPads the text, that might be easier for everyone to see what we have here.
Yeah, we all have copies.
We have copies, although the printouts, by the way, don't reflect, they're not marked to the version that we're looking at, and they don't show additions as a result. They're in a slightly lighter color, so it's a little harder to read. You're more than welcome to share them with the audience, but just know that they're not marked to the document we're considering. So.
Well, okay. Why Peter's passing out. So I propose to adopt my proposed language changes.
So there's a motion by Mr. Deuce to adopt some language in this page. Can you specify exactly which set of language you're referring to? Because there is a heavily marked page, and I don't know whether you're referring to everything that comes from page 2 on, or only a portion of it.
I'm only talking about what's proposed in that paragraph.
Paragraph 3.
Paragraph 3.
So you're proposing to make the changes that are marked on the handout on page 3 of the handout, identified under the numeral 3, and only in that paragraph. Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. Mason. Discussion.
As I mentioned in my intro, this is, I think, unhelpful for the task at hand. I've heard in another conversation that it's also unhelpful to have this kind of language out there when we, say, negotiate labor contracts. In times past, the attorneys for the other side have actually pointed to this kind of language as saying, gee, you say in your guidance letter that you're doing well in all measures, apparently. Why can't you help us out in the contract negotiations? So anyway, for lots of reasons, I would like to, if not eliminate the paragraph, reduce it as I had prepared.
Mr. Mason.
No, I think Mr. Bruce is right on about where these documents are used besides the budget process. These end up in mediation and labor negotiation. When we're doing that, we talk about all the trials and tribulations we go through in our budget process. And I think that is important when we have to, what what we're trying to say is
Ms. Crumick.
I'm sorry.
Ms. Crumick?
She just wants the mic on.
I'd like to know from Ms. Moriarty whether this language was back in the draft before this last weekend. I find this really concerning, not just this request to completely revamp this paragraph, but about a 5 or 6 page set of changes to a document that's been in play and been reviewed by the budget, the committee, that we're now being asked to rewrite it. And I really have a serious problem with that. If there are really new concepts that were never addressed, then I would say, yes, let's entertain them if we've missed something. But I just am struggling to figure out how much of this is just trying to change the intent versus what was not put in there in the first place.
Ms. Moriarty, can you respond to Ms. Crumick?
Yes, and this paragraph has been in the draft guidelines since the beginning, since we considered the first draft in September. It's actually a scaled-down paragraph than has been in several recent years of guidelines that have been approved by this committee. So it's not new information. What's interesting, I think that we've had this concern about our negotiating ability in labor contracts before, and we have been assured multiple times by our lead negotiator that really the information we put in our guidelines does not impact an outcome of a labor negotiation, because if it's not stated here, they're going to look at our financial statements, they're going to look at our trends, and this information is readily available. So it was his view that what we state in these guidelines and in other documents, I'm trying to remember the specific question when this came up last time, but it was during the last budget process, he doesn't feel this has an impact on settlement outcome.
Ms. Hess?
I think what's also important is that the trend is, as Leslie pointed out before, it's getting worse. You know, healthcare costs are rising. There's other things that are coming out there. And so this year is going to be a hard year, as will the upcoming future years. So I think to scale back this language and not be so optimistic is kind of in line with what we're being faced with. So I think it's better to not be so optimistic.
Mr. Mason, did you want to add something?
I have testified in arbitration cases for labor contracts for the town of Greenwich over a period of 6 years, and I've been handed budget guidelines, budget messages, first selectman budget messages numerous times. The question is, do you recognize this document? What is this? What is the purpose of this document? Can you read me excerpts from it? It has been used, and the reason that I think this is being brought up today is it's just in general conversation saying, you know, everything we write and do is part of the case. So if someone is telling someone that it's not being used, I'm telling you, I've had this document handed to me by outside counsel for several bargaining units.
Mr. Deuce?
I'd like to respond to Ms. Crumick. Yes, there's been, you've been working on this for the last 6 weeks, and there's been lots of opportunities to have feedback for you. But not until tonight have we had a chance to provide direct feedback. And I've not had a chance for direct feedback, and this is the opportunity to do that. And this is the time to speak up, and I really do feel strongly that this paragraph is wrong. And the effort, the whole letter could be improved by either amending it as I have proposed or deleting the whole paragraph.
Is there further discussion on this motion? Motion by Mr. Deuce, seconded by Mr. Mason to edit the paragraph identified under Roman numeral 3. Seeing no additional comments, I'm going to call for a name vote. If you are in favor of Mr. Deuce's motion, it's a yes. If you are not in favor, it's a no. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Deuce.
Yes.
Ms. Hess.
Yes.
Mr. Weisbrod?
No.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Mason?
No.
Ms. Crumick?
No.
Mr. Raymer?
No.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes.
Mr. Turner?
No.
Ms. Vasiliotis?
Yes.
And I am also a no, and that motion has failed. The vote is 6-6. Mr. Drake?
I'd like to propose a very brief amendment, which is in front of you, under the number 4, to delete the sentence that begins with the word recent, because it adds nothing.
Okay, we have a motion made by Mr. Drake, seconded by Ms. Tarkington, to delete the sentence under their handout number 4, and now I need to try to find it on the document.
Top of page 3.
Mine's page 2.
Maybe pagination.
Mr. Drake, perhaps since this is your motion, you can tell me where in the document I'm to find your edit.
Bottom of page 2, what's the bottom line of page 2?
Oh, so your representation doesn't include the entire paragraph. Okay, so,
It has the red line, and so I'm just proposing what's in the red line.
right, but in terms of the document itself, you're taking out you're proposing to take out the second sentence of the last paragraph on page 2.
Yes.
Okay, so, just trying to keep notes. So Mr. Drake's motion is removing the second sentence in the last paragraph of page 2. The paragraph begins, the BET continues to monitor external trends. And the sentence he's proposing to be removed is recent town budgets are not reliant on revenues from the state. That was seconded by Ms. Tarkington. Is there any discussion? Ms. Tarkington?
I just make the comment here that the state has, over the past several years, reduced its revenues to the town, be it grants, its payment in lieu of taxes, and so forth. I think this has created some hardships for both our budgeting and has made it difficult to plan. I think that's different from making the statement that we aren't reliant on these revenues. We have been reliant, and that's how we have produced our structures for our budget and our mill rate. So I think that this sentence should be deleted. Thank you.
Mr. Turner?
Madam Chairman, I would propose the following amendment, and that is that beginning with the next paragraph, following the paragraph that Mr. Drake has highlighted, that all of the remaining marks in the document be adopted. I would move that all of the remaining proposed changes in the document, this is an amendment to Mr. Drake's motion, beginning with the paragraph after the proposed change that he has made be adopted.
I'm not sure one can amend an amendment, and I'm not sure what your amendment is either. So we're going to dispose of Mr. Drake's amendment to delete that sentence, and then I'll come back to you to understand what you're proposing.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, is there, Ms. Moriarty?
Just to add a comment, the reason that sentence is in there is because there is, I'm not sure, a common understanding on what level of revenues are our proposed budget is dependent on from the state, and as the statement says, that we are not reliant. So I think it adds useful information to someone who doesn't know what we do have in our budgets.
Ms. Vasiliotis.
The reason why I'm supporting this change is we start the sentence out as we continue to monitor external trends, but then we talk about our recent town budget. So it's really not related to the monitoring of external trends, which may impact our fiscal health. Perhaps we could say that, revenues to town budgets, if you want to keep a sentence like that in, it should track the monitoring of external trends, not saying that we're not reliant on revenue trends. So I just think that either we remove the sentence or we can amend that sentence to be consistent with monitoring external trends.
So let me just see whether I understand what you're saying. In addition to editing and drafting the document on the fly, you are now editing the amendment so that we're thoroughly confused.
No, I'm making the comment saying that if you look at that sentence, it does not track what the intent of the first sentence is. So we either delete this, I would recommend, I would support the amendment to delete the sentence. However, if you want to talk about not being reliant on trends, we could consider another amendment if you want. And yes, it would be on the fly because, I'm listening to what people are saying here. To reflect the fact that we are monitoring external trends, and the trend is that we're not going to receive the monies that we used to receive. But again, we're saying recent town budgets are not reliant on revenues from the state when we're talking about monitoring external trends, which is not consistent with what that paragraph is saying.
Okay. Are there further comments? Mr. Raymer?
At the appropriate time, and I'm trying to decide what is the appropriate time, I'm going to ask that the body consider the following. We have these amendments, these proposed amendments have been distributed to us. They were distributed to us by email with the exception of one that's been withdrawn subsequently. We've all read them. I wonder whether or not the time of the body would be more efficiently used if these journalistic changes could be considered as one motion rather than being taken up one at a time. There's a large number of them, a couple of dozen of them. And I don't know if that's properly an amendment to Mr. Drake's motion on paragraph 4 or whether or not if I sit here and wait for the next motion on paragraph 5, I'm in the same mode. I don't know at what point under Robert's rules it's appropriate for me to say, as a point of order, I'd like the body to vote on whether or not they would perhaps entertain all of these journalistic changes as being a single motion rather than one by one.
Okay, so we are discussing an amendment on the floor. I don't know whether your motion or your discussion is the same as Mr. Turner's. And after we dispose of this motion, if you would like to make a motion, then I will turn to you for a motion.
Is Jeff's comment in the point of a...
We're not going to discuss...
Just a procedural question. Is it in the form of a point of order?
It was a point of order to the extent that I was seeking guidance from the chair as to what is the appropriate moment at which I may make such a motion if she is going to be entertaining these motions one by one, line by line. There's no moment in that I can see that is more appropriate than now. And so I think it could be an amendment to this motion. It could be entertained as an amendment to this motion, that his motion, that Mr. Drake's motion be expanded to be not just item number 4, but all of the remaining journalistic items on the list. If there are any other items that are substantive, not journalistic, I can understand that a member may wish to carve that out, but otherwise I think the body's time would be better used to vote on these as a block.
Okay, thank you for clarifying, Mr. Raymer. We have an amendment on the floor proposed by Mr. Drake, seconded by Ms. Tarkington. It is to delete the second sentence of the last paragraph of page 2, lest we lose track. Any further discussion on this item? I'd like to respond to Ms. Vasiliotis. I actually interpret both of those sentences, the first on monitoring external trends, and the second, the town budgets not being reliant on revenues from the state, as being true, not inconsistent, and therefore I'm not going to vote to approve your motion, and I just think that clearly there's a difference of opinion on whether or not they're consistent. I will call for a voice vote on this as well, starting, I guess, with Mr. Deuce. If you are in favor of Mr. Drake's amendment, please vote yes. If you are opposed, please vote no.
Yes.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Yes.
No.
No.
Mr. Raymer.
No.
Yes. No.
And I'm also a no. That motion has failed. 6-6.
I wonder if the chair would recognize me if
Mr. Turner had a motion first.
So Mr. Turner was first to raise his hand that he wanted to make another motion. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just in the interest of moving things along, I would propose that the body consider the remaining marks on the document, beginning with what we're seeing as proposed new paragraph under number 5, that all of these items be taken up together in one motion and one discussion.
Okay. We have a motion on the floor to take all of the suggested changes by the Republican caucus up in one combined motion. It was moved by Mr. Turner, seconded by Mr. Raymer. That motion is open for discussion. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In looking at the remaining marks, I'm not seeing anything here that is material in nature that would really have an impact on those that are responsible for updating budgets and devising budgets to meet within the proposed guidelines. Also, I think we've got to say that, we've basically now turned a full BET meeting into a document markup meeting, which really should be done in committee. And I just hope that going forward we would be mindful of that. Members can attend committee meetings and make proposals and so forth. I would just ask for that courtesy going forward if we could, please.
Mr. Mason.
I can't support this motion because I would bring to the attention of everybody that items 7, 13, and 16 on the document are not being moved forward. The other thing I would say, I hear a lot about time, and I think this is a very ploy position to cut off debate and not have conversation. And I think it's effective, and it may be successful. But I think I've been through more guidelines than anybody sitting on this board. And I will tell you that on 9/14, the original draft came out for a 9/17 meeting, and it was a healthy discussion. There was even a request or conversation about a work session for all of the BET members to be involved. We offered positions at that time. We had, on 10/18, 2 days before our next on 10/18 was our next budget committee meeting, and 2 days before that, a draft came, significantly changed. And I want to thank Leslie and Leslie, who were the spearheads on this. It's a short window for caucus meetings when you get a draft that's basically a couple days before you have to meet on it. We also offered a special meeting in the interest of time, and I was at that special meeting, and I'm not sure everybody else was, so when we talk about time consideration. Again, we got a revised draft. We had it over the weekend. Caucuses sometimes happen on the weekends, I do know that. But I think there has been a short time. So for the other members, and I will specifically say, I'll take your attention to item 5 and item, I think it's 7. I'm not sure what the 2 items were. I specifically said in the Budget Committee meeting that I think some of our other members have some concerns, more aligned with some of the things going on in the state and the taxes that are changing on a federal level. And I think I said it fairly clearly. So I've seen caucuses show up with complete redrafts. Some of this is Scribner. I appreciate the Scribner changes. We're arguing language. This document gets better every year. I think I voted for it, and I think when I voted for it, I said I think this document is ready to go to the BET for the rest of the members' input. So I don't mind if you're going to make it obvious that you're not willing to have the conversations about items that some members on the board feel popular. If you think we formed a special committee, Mr. Weisbrod and Mr. Deuce, to really look into the potential pitfalls to the town of Greenwich taxpayer for what's possibly going on at the state with the teacher pension, and they spent an enormous amount of time and reported back to us, and yet that's the next item on the list. But we don't want to consider that. We don't think that work that we did is important for the taxpayers to know that we did it. Okay. Thank you.
Madam Chairman?
Mr. Turner.
Yes, thank you. Just for the record, my document is showing that the following paragraphs have been withdrawn, which is 7. Want to make sure that we're clear on that. Mr. Mason makes a great point. 13 and 16.
Ms. Vasiliotis. Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Turner.
I'd just like to address a few things. I was at most of the Budget Committee meetings when the guidelines were being discussed. I was there for yesterday's and for last week's meeting as well. At no time were members asked for their opinion on what was being discussed by the Budget Committee at the meetings. The final draft that was approved by the Budget Committee was received by us yesterday with some changes. And I do think that, again, yesterday to today, our caucus was emailing back and forth, reviewing the letter, and this was the result of what came out of those discussions. I do think that there's more than just, there are substantive changes that I think we should discuss. I don't think that this is a complete redrafting, although I would point out that in the past, the Democrat caucus did actually present a total redraft of the budget guidelines because they didn't like what was going on. We chose not to do that. We just chose to make comments to the current version. And I do think that they deserve to be heard.
Okay, the motion on the table, let me remind everyone, is a motion to take up all the changes in the document at once. That motion has been seconded. There is, in my view, an opportunity for any member to speak on any item that is on the table. I don't believe it is accurate to say that discussion is quashed in any way, shape, or form. You have been given, some might say, very broad range to make comments on the matter under discussion. So I will take exception to the idea that the BET is not a fully participatory body. Certainly everyone is called on when they indicate that they have a comment on the material under discussion. That is my little qualification. Someone had their hand up now. I can't remember. Ms. Moriarty.
So I appreciate the suggestions to try to move the discussion along a little more quickly. I don't think the intent was to squash debate. And I do reference Ms. Oberlander's comment that we can still comment on each individual one if we want to. I'm going to take a leap of faith here, which is always very dangerous, but in the proposals that are remaining, I think that number 5, 10, and 14 are the most substantive, with the rest being, some are just wording changes, others are adding, are clarifications of information I think we're already going to receive. Can I make a suggestion maybe that we separate 5, 10, and 14 for debate, and then group the others? I want to see how my colleagues think about that. With reference, not to sound defensive, but in the Budget Committee meeting, I will always recognize a BET member to participate in the meeting, and I did not see anyone, I didn't see it, but you've seen me run the meetings before. It is the best opportunity to have the full-ranging conversation about changes and ideas. Also, this document has been clearly under discussion for a period of time, and I don't believe anyone but Ms. Tarkington emailed me specific suggestions to go through. She may be representing others, but I didn't get anyone reaching out. So tempted to run a collaborative process. We're here now. Let's get through this and try and get to a final document. So we have 2 ways to go. We can consider the motion on the table. We can segregate out 5, 10, and 14, which I think represents the most substantive comments, or go one by one.
Mr. Weisbrod.
I would speak in support of Mr. Turner's motion. And just for the record, I also salute the work that my colleague, Mr. Deuce, did mainly with my engagement in terms of the state budgetary problems. And I think that has been vetted here at the BET. It was released via the BET, as I recall, and it has been treated with care and seriousness, and it should be. And, you know, on the issue, on the substance of what is written, I as a partner with Mr. Deuce, am in full agreement. We have major headwinds as we look at the problems of the state of Connecticut. However, when I look at all of the different changes that are being proposed, the question of materiality and relevance comes to mind. In other words, what's the purpose of this document? The document is designed to provide guidance to the departments as to what our expectation is in terms of what they submit, in terms of their budget requests. And, I mean, the fundamental point here is not to, you know, preach to them about fiscal conditions and so forth, is to give them specific and direct guidance. And I think we achieve that mainly in the range of the mill rate increase that we talk about, and in some of the other specifics as it pertains to what we're looking for these departments to do. So none of the things that I look at here alter that critical, a message that we're providing through the guidance. And so I'm of the view that this sort of draftsmanship, if you will, is really something that should belong in the committees and is best suited for the committees and not really for the BET as a whole. And hence, I do support Mr. Turner's amendment or motion.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, Ms. Chairman. I'm not quite sure what Ms. Moriarty was proposing, but if she put that in the form of an amendment to Mr. Turner's motion, then perhaps I would second that.
We're not going to take amendments to amendments. We have an amendment on the floor. The amendment is to move forward all of the remaining marked changes in the document that was distributed, except for items 13, 15, and 16. That motion was made by Mr. Turner and seconded by Mr. Raymer. That is the motion that's on the floor. Any member can speak to the substance of those.
I'm sorry, do you?
And 7, too, Madam Chairman.
7, 13, 16.
Can you confirm which ones?
Sorry,
have
I
been
wrote down,
withdrawn?
sorry, that
'Cause
was,
I
I
don't
was
think that
reading
was ever
Mike's, sorry, I was reading Mike's notes. 7, 13, and 16.
That's correct. And they're marked withdrawn on the one we did.
13 and 15 or 16?
16.
16. Okay. Is there any further discussion on this motion? Okay. Ms. Tarkington?
Again, I believe that there are certainly substantive sections in here to amend, including things such as the capital, when we have, $124 million of capital that has been appropriated but not yet addressed in terms of completion. I think that the discussion that we can have on some of these amendments has been well thought out, and I would hope that it would be considered by this body, and I think our residents deserve that kind of reflection and consideration of not only what one caucus is putting forth, but also to make sure that the other has its opportunity.
Mr. Turner?
Yes, Madam Chairman, I would totally agree with Ms. Tarkington, and I think therein lies the point of having all of these items dealt with at one time. Going through the budget process, we will know far more, for example, about the impact of the federal tax reform in February, March, and April. We'll know far more about a lot of things that in capital, we would know more specific numbers about the capital need at that time. So I agree with her that everyone should be heard. And something tells me that we will be talking about these issues more than one time, ad nauseum. Is that what the attorneys say? We will probably be headed in that direction. So I think the taxpayers will, and among all of us, we will have ample opportunity to talk about all of these items and on more than one occasion. Thank you.
Further discussion on this motion?
This is not a motion to approve these items. This is a motion only of whether we're going to entertain them as a block. And if you're voting yes, we're voting yes, we'll entertain it as a block. If you're voting no, we don't wish to do it as a block. Is that the answer?
Well, I'm not exactly sure but I think that was the way the motion read, that we're going to take up all changes as a block versus, and then we'll have if that passes, we will have a vote on the substance of the amendment. Okay. So on the Turner motion to take up all changes as a block, if you are in favor, please vote yes. And if you are opposed, please vote no. I'll start with Ms. Vasiliotis.
No.
Mr. Turner?
Aye.
Ms. Tarkington?
No.
Yes.
Ms. Crumick?
No.
Ms. Moriarty?
I'm going to vote no.
Mr. Mason?
No. No.
Yes.
No.
No.
Okay. And I'm also going to vote no, which is a 3-9-0 vote. That motion has failed.
No.
Recognize me for further motion?
Yes. Mr. Raymer?
I would move then that we take the remaining items up as a block, except I'm pulling out of the list the ones that have been marked with a digit 5, the one that was marked with a digit 10, and the one that was marked with a digit 14. Did I do that correctly? I'm looking for some assistance from Ms. Moriarty, I believe.
Those are the ones I identified. You're making the motion?
Ms. Moriarty, would you like to comment on Mr. Raymer's motion? Is
Can I
that?
comment before I second?
Yes.
An alternative way to do it, just to get the conversations moving, is to ask the chair to take those three out of order, to take up 5, 10, and 14, and then see where we are, as we can take up the rest.
I would gratefully accept that suggestion. Or Mr. Moriarty's motion, either one.
Okay, these amendments have not yet been proposed, so there is no out of order.
Oh, that's true.
Actually, so I'm not sure what the motion is, but Mr. Raymer, are you making a motion, or?
Tell you what, I would propose that we now entertain the proposed amendment, which is marked as paragraph 5, or digit 5.
Okay, we now have Mr. Raymer putting, can't make this stuff up. We now have Mr. Raymer moving to introduce proposed new paragraph 5. Do I have a second?
I second it.
Seconded by Mr. Deuce. Mr. Raymer, would you like to explain your motion?
And not being a complete dope, I'm going to defer to Mr. Dewis to discuss paragraph number 5.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Raymer.
Mr. Deuce.
And my apologies for such a long insert at this late stage, but I really feel strongly that the current guidelines, as currently drafted, do a great job of saying what we expect the town and the administrators to come back with in terms of guidelines, but we don't really explain why. And this is a great opportunity for us to explain to those who see our letter, it's not just the town departments, it might have a broader circulation, that we have some very major substantive issues. And as Mr. Weisbrot mentioned earlier, this is an area that we had studied as a subcommittee for the BET last winter. These issues have gotten worse since then, and it's not unlikely that we could have a couple of surprises, or maybe they're not surprises, hit us at some point during this next fiscal year. Let me pause there and allow others who like to comment.
Okay, we have a motion to add a new paragraph identified under 5. And Mr. Raymer and Mr. Deuce, would you like to advise us where you propose this paragraph to sit?
Sorry, this would be the final paragraph in the section on operating budget guidelines. Oh, hang on. No, on current conditions. Sorry.
Right before operating budget guidelines.
No. It would be the final paragraph under current conditions.
Yeah, right before operating budget.
Sorry, just before operating budget guidelines. Sorry.
Okay, so we have a proposal to add three paragraphs at the close of the current conditions section to precede the operating budget guidelines section. This has been proposed by Mr. Raymer and seconded by Mr. Deuce. Open for discussion. Okay. So I will, Ms. Moriarty.
Just so the suggestion doesn't go without a response, I'm not going to support it. I think, these guidelines are targeted towards what our operating departments and schools need to respond to of what we know now of how they're going to affect the town. There's a lot of ifs and what ifs, and this could happen and that could happen, that we don't really know how things are going to play out. Some of those don't affect town departments. Some of those may play out so differently. This could be a worst-case scenario. There could be other things coming down the pike. I don't think it adds to the function of the document that we're approving now.
Mr. Deuce.
Well, one of the things that has already happened, which is federal tax reform, which takes effect this year, and it has the effect of really materially increasing the cost of local government for our residents. And if you're in a position where your state and local taxes are above $10,000, you lose deductibility. If you're in say a 1/3 tax bracket, the marginal cost of that is 50%. The cost of local government comes up 50%. That has happened. People don't realize it yet. They'll realize it next summer when they pay the taxes, or next April, but it's happening. And anyway, so I do feel we need to provide context and sort of background on why we were feeling strong that we should be as prudent as possible as we construct this budget.
Ms. Vasiliotis.
I would support Mr. Deuce's remarks, but I would also add that, we're asking town departments to look hard at their budgets and to basically limit their growth. And without this context, I mean, basically, we're talking about things that will, some things that have happened and some things that may happen, and in high probability will happen based on our state's financial mess, that could impact our local residents and could add to their tax burden. So I don't see any harm in putting this in. These are things that, I mean, we're saying that we're concerned about future financial challenges, many beyond our control. We're just pointing out that these things may occur. I don't see the harm in putting it in. I don't see the harm in basically discussing it. And I don't think it takes away anything if we do.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, I'm also in support. I think that while the paragraphs 1 and 2 reflect the work done previously by Mr. Weisbrod and Mr. Deuce, I think paragraph 3 also puts forth something that we aren't used to in the town of Greenwich, and that is, once again, like 10 years ago, with our revaluation, there could be a substantial impact on property values, and property values could decline. And for most people in the town of Greenwich, your investment in your home is your largest single asset. So I think putting this in here and so advising our town employees, departments, and their boards that these are kind of things they need to consider is really enhances the budget guidelines at this point in time.
Ms. Cromick.
I am not in favor of including this. Certainly these are some of the items that are listed in here are facts that we don't know yet what the impact is going to be. And for just that reason, I don't think we should be including what we think may happen or what might have been considered in a budget process at the state level a year ago. We don't. I just think we're moving into a area that isn't terra firma as far as what we are actually basing our concerns on.
Mr. Drake.
I think in particular paragraph 2 is an elephant. We can ignore it, but I wouldn't recommend ignoring the elephant in the room. And I think this is helpful to all of us. Like Ms. Moriarty said, this is a challenge budget. These are some of the reasons why this is a challenge budget, and they deserve to be spoken about. And also, the fact that they're not certainties is not a reason to exclude them. We're here making decisions with lots of uncertainties ahead of us. You can't ignore risks coming at you just because you can't precisely predict them. You can never precisely predict the risks, but you can mention them and be aware of them, and we have a duty to do that, I think.
Mr. Weisbrod.
So, of course, I share many of the concerns working with Mr. Deuce that's highlighted in paragraph 5. We do have substantial headwinds. But I think the relevant question that we need to ask ourselves is, what, if any, impact would these headwinds have on our decision vis-a-vis, do we pave the roads? Do we have the police that we have? Would we want to sacrifice, the number of teachers we have? Do we want to impair the fundamental services that the town provides? I mean, the headwinds exist. We don't know where they're going to take us, but we're not saying that because of the headwinds, then we're going to, thoughtlessly reduce our budget because of headwinds in order to offset the headwinds. And that's the work of the BET throughout the year. And so we're going to have headwinds, but we still have to pave the roads. We still have to pay the police force. We still have to, have schools that attract people that come to the town of Greenwich. And so we should be mindful of headwinds, absolutely. I think it's a very articulate statement, but it really has, unless what we want to do is say, well, because of these headwinds, we're going to take this thing down to 0% or maybe negative 2%, because the people in the town of Greenwich simply can't bear these costs anymore. It's unbearable. And therefore, let's tackle this and take an action step and reduce the budget guidelines by at least 1 or 2% to reflect these. We're not doing that, or maybe that's already embedded in this range that we put into the budget guidelines. And so, while the statement is thoughtful, everything that Mr. Deuce does is thoughtful, I'm not sure it really belongs here in this document, and I'm not sure what the ramifications of it are, and that's my comment.
Okay, I'd like to echo Mr. Weisbrod's comments. I have great confidence in the work of Mr. Deuce and Mr. Weisbrod, and I know that they will continue their monitoring efforts. I also have great confidence in our department heads and town employees, who I believe are very cognizant of the fiscal pressures that the state and this town are under and that the BET reinforces, and I don't think that we need to include rhetoric about those potential eventualities in this document. I think it clouds what we're trying to accomplish, which is to really give direction on the type of budget and the kind of conversations that we want to have. It's implicit in setting the targeted increase for the mill rate that we accounted for these issues, and I do thank Mr. Deuce and Mr. Weisbrod for their past work and what will, I'm sure, be a future project. So I'm not going to, despite having asked for that working group and being very appreciative of the work, I'm not going to vote to include this language. We now have a motion on the table to include what's listed as insertion number 5, 3 paragraphs at the end of current conditions to proceed operating budget guidelines. I will call for a voice vote starting with Mr. Deuce. If you're in favor, please vote yes. If you're opposed, vote no.
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Weisbod.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Ms. Crumick.
No.
Mr. Raymer.
No.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yes.
Mr. Turner.
No.
Ms. Vasiliotis.
Yes.
And I'm also a no. That motion has failed on a 6-6 vote.
Would the chair recognize me for a motion?
Mr. Drake was first, okay.
I was
That's
kind
great.
of trying to signal my friend, Ms. Vasiliotis. Am I up on this, or are you?
I think we're going to have an opposing motion.
No.
I'll
I
move
will gladly listen to your
but I
motion.
thought Karen was going to, but one of us will.
Well, no, I think we were.
Okay, so Mr. Drake was recognized, not to have a dialogue, but to make a motion. If you're not making a motion, I'm going to recognize whoever raises their hand who would like. Mr. Raymer, I think, had his hand up to make a motion. Mr. Raymer.
I would then ask that we entertain proposed amendment number 10.
Okay, so Mr. Raymer has moved
Consideration of paragraph.
consideration of paragraph number 10, which is identified as BOE staffing. Is there a second for that motion?
Second.
Seconded by Ms. Hess.
So to orient, well, of course, I don't know if my pagination is the same, but on page 5 of my draft, in the middle of the page is a paragraph 3, and I believe the proposed amendment offers some additional language there. It's under the general heading of development of operating budgets.
Okay, thank you. So we have a motion on the floor made by Mr. Raymer, seconded by Ms. Hess. It amends paragraph 3 on page 5. The header is BOE staffing. and it inserts an additional sentence that reads, as mentioned above, staffing costs represent the majority of the BOE's operating budget. 2 additional sentences. The BOE should continually examine administrative staffing levels for the most efficient structure in order to achieve savings in employee costs. I'd like to open for discussion.
I would,
Mr. Raymer.
I would defer the usual privilege of the movement to speak first and pass that privilege to Ms. Hess if she wishes to speak.
Ms. Hess.
I'm going to actually pass it to Ms. Fasciotis, or I'm happy to take it.
No, that's fine.
Oh, okay. I think here, all we're trying to say is there's such a focus on the certified staff at the Board of Ed, and we just want to make sure that when we're looking at staffing, we're also looking at the administrative staff, and just in terms of being efficient, there have been talks about different departments and what we do, and so we're just, I think this is in the spirit of what we already all believe, so we just wanted to clarify that.
Ms. Vasiliotis.
Yeah, and I would also just add that, the constant comment that we keep hearing is that the staffing costs represent the majority of each of the department's operating budget, and we've been hearing more and more complaints about it. And again, this is in the spirit of trying to control costs and trying to have departments look at everything, not just one thing. And we always mention certified staff, but we never seem to mention administrative staff, and this is just one way of highlighting that.
Ms. Moriarty.
The point that you're making about examining all staff really is reflected in number 2, staffing focus. That represents, it says the town's budget, it's really the consolidated town budget, including schools. Number 3 was specifically targeted to the discussion that this body often has about staffing level changes year to year, and what's the genesis of the certified staffing level. And there's often confusion of whether in prior guidelines, there was a no head count increase statement, and then yet the Board of Ed, if they have enrollment increases, would often request staffing, and whether that was consistent or not consistent with guidelines. So the point of number 3 was specifically targeted to certified staff as it relates to enrollment. Maybe that's a Scribner's kind of error to say certified staffing there. And I would say number 2, the staffing focus, which we are asking all departments to look at every staff position, really covers the Board of Ed as well as the town. I don't know, maybe with that explanation, you don't see that additional clarification is necessary.
Ms. Crumick.
No, I'm not going to make any comment.
Ms. Vasiliotis.
Again, I do think it is necessary to clarify, because when I read this first, I'm reading town's budget. When we think of town, we think of the town side versus the BOE. And my first impression was that, we're asking the town side to do this, but not asking the BOE to do it. So, if we want to clarify that in paragraph 2, I mean, I understand when you say all departments, but again, we're saying town's budget. The BOE always makes a point of saying we're not part of the town's budget, we're a separate budget. Again, just for clarification.
Yeah.
Ms. Moriarty.
If I look at the specific wording, though, because the concept-wise, if this body believes we need to specifically talk about all of the Board of Ed staffing, I would want them to talk about efficient structure and service levels. Here, you're tying administrative staffing only to achieve savings in employee costs, and that's not necessarily the only objective I would want to have in a staffing discussion.
Ms. Crumick.
I was going to propose that we take out the "in order to achieve savings in employment costs." Would that us get closer to where Ms. Moriarty was going?
Okay, we're not going to take an amendment to an amendment. So we have an amendment on the floor introduced by Mr. Raymer, seconded by Ms. Hess, to add 2 sentences into the BOE staffing. Is there further discussion on this proposed amendment? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to call for a name vote. If you're in favor of this motion, please vote yes. If you are opposed, please vote no. Ms. Vasiliotis?
Yes.
Mr. Turner?
No.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes.
Mr.
No.
Raymer? Ms. Crumick?
No.
Ms. Moriarty?
No.
Mr. Mason?
Yes.
Mr.
No.
Weisbrod?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And I'm also a no. That motion has failed 6-6. Mr. Raymer?
I would move the consideration.
Item 14, would you care to tell me where in the document?
It is replacement language for the heading paragraph that is the first paragraph appearing under capital budget guidelines. In my draft, it appears in the lower portion of the page 6, but it's the first paragraph after the capital budget guidelines heading. It adds a sentence.
I'm glad you
I-
corrected that, because it adds a sentence, a penultimate sentence, rather
Yes.
than replacing language.
Okay, I mean, the proposed 14 offers the entire paragraph, of which only one sentence is new.
The penultimate sentence.
The penultimate sentence. I don't use such words, but the penultimate sentence.
Okay. We have a motion by Mr. Raymer, seconded by Ms. Tarkington. What is on the document, the moved budget guidelines in the first paragraph of the capital budget guidelines to add a sentence to be the penultimate sentence to read, the BET expects that all capital costs, town and BOE for fiscal 1920 will not exceed $42 million in total.
I would defer to Mrs. Tarkington on the usual privilege of the movement to speak first.
So I think that we made great progress in the current budget guidelines letter. Previously, it referred to the $67 million in capital, which is just a, proposed amount, and without really a lot of substantive support. And that does not include the $15 million, which is in the revenue fund, so a total of $82 million. In our budget guidelines decisions, I think that's the most recent draft that we're working with. I think that's an appropriate movement. This basically adds, though, a cap or guidance. I'd rather use the word guidance here. Perhaps the word exceed shouldn't be there. Maybe it should be approximately. But I wouldn't want to sort of do anything on the fly here, so I'd just like to make some additional comments. I mean, this is a very similar process to what we had last year when we looked at capital. What was projected for the current year was some $68 million for both the general fund and the revenue funds, but was reduced when we finally got to approval, reviewed the projects and so forth, down to something like $43 million, basically an amount that all of us thought was, or at least the departments proposed, was something that they could complete in this fiscal year. The reality is that even though they assured us that they could complete more projects and have more focus this year, that has not materialized. We have, at this point in time, $124 million of projects appropriated with encumbered or available balances. We have, of those, $77 million are town projects, $24 million are BOE projects without New Lebanon School, and New Lebanon adds another just over $23 million to come up to the total of $124 million. So this basically puts a realism onto it. It also makes, I think, hopefully, this also provides focus. So both the town and the BOE will focus on their critical and large remediation projects that they're doing on two of our very important schools, Greenwich High School and Western. So I think it's important to, focus on projects that can be completed. And again, adding even something like $42 million to $124 million is, a huge task in terms of bringing to closure. And I hope that our departments can get more realistic about what they can accomplish in a budgeted year.
Further discussion. Ms. Moriarty.
I want to recognize that Ms. Tarkington has been making this comment for several years on the amount of open appropriations, and I believe this guidelines, as presented, much more fully cover that issue, that we put a lot of emphasis on getting information about what the open appropriations are and how I expect the conversations in February will be about how the departments expect to complete them. We know that DPW finally has a solution to the MMR agreement with the state, and we would expect movement on all of those backlogged projects. That being said, we also know that the fiscal 20 capital budget, as you said, in last year's capital plan was a much higher number than that 43. It includes a few one-time projects, or a few projects that are all coming at the same time, the Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, a few others that are on the pike. And I believe that we will have that the proposal we're going to get in the fiscal 20 capital budget won't be closely aligned with what we've seen last year. I think there's new information out there, both on the town side. We know that the schools have a lot of new information about their capital plan and what they can and can't accomplish, and what they need to do for their buildings. And I don't think restricting the conversation by putting in an arbitrary number helps us in the long run. I don't know what capital budget we'll end up approving, but I want to have the discussion over what the needs of the town are and how both the first selectman and the schools Board of Education view about what those needs are and when they need to have them. And so I strongly disagree with putting a number in here. I think the way the guidelines is written, there is definitely a message in here to limit the request to what's needed and to what can be accomplished. And I think we've done a more effective job at that this year than we have in the past.
Mr. Drake.
Back up in big picture, I'd just like to say, I think these guidelines were well done under Leslie's leadership, and that I think ideas from the two Republican members were reflected and put in, and it was done with respect, and you could see that it has just the feel of work done by somebody who's interested in the best interest of the town. It's not a partisan thing. So I like these guidelines, and I'm going to vote for them, and I think Ms. Moriarty's leadership did a good job, and also all four members. That said, I think we need a capital number. In town, we don't spend capital the way we spend operating. I remember a short anecdote, but when Nancy Weissler was chairman of HR, some woman department head came to us to combine two jobs and replace it with a permanent, and it was a $10,000 cost. And we absolutely tortured that poor woman over $10,000 of operating expense. And now I'm on the new Lebanon Building Committee, and we used to throw around numbers. Is it going to cost $32 million or $37 million or $34? And the millions fly through your fingers in capital in a way that they don't in operating. And sorry. And so I think it's so important, and it's so large, and it has consequences for so many years, that an improvement of budget guidelines for these and all future ones is they need a capital number. And let me add another thing. It's in Exhibit 1. We didn't not say it. There's a $67 million capital number in Exhibit 1. So anybody who looks at it, or the taxpayer who reflects on it, can figure that $67 million of capital is coming his way or her way. So I think the thing is in here. You can't not say it because you did say it. And just to be full disclosure and to have our arms fully wrapped around the town's finances this year, we have a duty to manage in a comprehensive way in the big picture capital spending, and that really, I think, obligates the guidelines to touch on and face. It's a hard issue, but to touch on it and face it, we have the responsibility.
Mr. Mason.
This is one, I want to share, I think I'm on both sides of this conversation. I think the original draft that we contemplated in September had the $67 million language. Thank you, Leslie, yeoman's work. I agree with that. However, if we go back to the roots of our capital thinking, every year we did have a targeted number. We've had recent conversations with other committees and involved in the government, and there was always talk about keeping it in the low 40s for the short time. I think there was several reasons, remediation being one. But if you don't have a target, so in essence, you're going to have a public hearing, there's going to be people lined up with a list of capital projects. And if you don't have a target, I guess you don't have a priority other than saying yes to everything. And the original CIP, and I think we've drifted from it slightly, and we've made modifications, positive and maybe not always positive, is to be able to say, look, you can watch your project move up. But if we're going to go into capital, are we going to have a debate of 12 of us of what's acceptable level of capital commitment? We have to, you heard Leslie even use the word approximate instead of exceed. The point is we do need a targeted range, because how are we going to sit there and make decisions that affect future budgets? You know, I always say we look at one budget. We shouldn't do that. We should be looking at the effect of the decade. And this is one of the areas that I do believe we need to give some kind of indication of where our threshold is. It does, like we always say, it doesn't mean that something's not going to come in and deviate from guidelines. But the point I'm trying to make is we do need some kind of a targeted point.
Ms. Tarkington.
I want to add one thing to Mr. Drake's comments. He is correct that there is $67 million in capital in this proposed worksheet, you know, the number sheet. But that's for the general fund, and figured into the other revenue funds, we have the additional $15 million. So in total, it is figured in there in the budget, as Mr. Drake has pointed out, but in total at $82 million. But he's correct, it's 67 for the general fund. Thank you.
Ms. Cromick.
I'd just like to point out that I think there's a difference between a targeted number and a cap, and what's in here appears to be a cap.
Ms. Hess.
I'm just concerned about messaging, and if there is, you know, I think as Mr. Drake pointed out, a number that's sitting there in Exhibit 1, that's $67 million, it really is giving a misleading indicator, and that's not even taking into consideration the capital that's outside the general fund. And so if I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, wow, it's $67 million, right? So so maybe we don't, that's not what we're thinking, $67 million, but that's what we're saying, right? I mean, I know that the number the mathematical number that's coming out on Exhibit 1 is outside our target, which means we need to make up some shortfall. But how are we going to figure it out? It seems very misleading to me.
Mr. Raymer.
So we were careful in the revisions of the draft to take out reference to the $67 million. We preferred not to have a figure. And the logic of that was that the CIP committee has not yet worked. And we want them to come forward with what they're proposing. I don't need to have a figure in here for me to know what my job is next March and what my job is next May. We'll make prudent judgments at the time. I don't want to quote a figure here and then want to approve only less later on. I think I've misled the public. I don't want to have a figure here and approve more later on. I think I've misled the public. I don't think I'm really in a position to offer a figure until I've seen what CIP is proposing. Everybody who's involved in this process know that, in fact, we're not saying 67 million. 67 million appears nowhere in these guidelines. There's an Exhibit 1 attached, which plucks a figure out of the capital plan, the 15-year capital plan, and that's what that figure is. It doesn't pretend to be otherwise, and there's nobody who misunderstands. I would rather not have a figure. I will vote against this change, but I will gladly use my prudence in March to establish what seems to be an appropriate figure for us, and I will not be assisted or hampered by whether we did or did not include a figure back in October.
Ms. Moriarty.
Just a clarification, because I think I'm the only one who looks at level service budgeted as level service budget, which means showing the information we have at hand. And what we have at hand for fiscal 20 capital is what's in last year's plan. I'm not sure, maybe it is possible that Mr. Geiger could put a parenthetical comment after current year projects and say, per the fiscal 19 capital plan, so that it shows the source of that number. I understand the concerns. I think that as a BET member, I want to hear almost more from the Board of Education what their capital forecast really is. And I'm not sure I would get that full conversation and disclosure by picking a number. I don't believe we're going to see a significant increase in their request for fiscal 20. The projects that, that caused the capital number to jump from the 40 some odd that's this year to 67 include $12 million for Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, $2.5 million for Greenwich Ave Streetscape. Well, they haven't come for release of funds on the planning money for that. They have 2 more DPW projects and 3 more Board of Ed projects. I think that all of that is in flux, and I think we want to have the conversation, but I also go back to, I guess, my original point, sorry to be repetitive, is that the way the guidelines are currently written, they clearly state that there is a limit to the capital that we will be approving, and it's not opening floodgates as drafted. Thank you.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yeah, I mean, I think Leslie is correct in what she said, but one just has to, point out that this budget does show, just for the general fund alone, a 66% increase in capital spending. And then that really forces, because of these large capital expenditures, an 80% increase in borrowings. And quite frankly, obviously, we all will be working together to make sure that all of this is realistic and so forth. But I think it's delivering a message that goes beyond the message we want to deliver. But I just wanted to add that.
Ms. Vasiliotis.
I just would like to add that a number of RTM committees, Finance and BOC, have expressed surprise that there is no general number placed in the guidelines, and they were questioning why that was.
Well, perhaps they are listening in on TV, and then they will have a full explanation, probably more than they had anticipated. Are there further comments on this amendment? So we have on the floor in front of us a proposal by Mr. Raymer, seconded by Ms. Tarkington, to add a sentence into the introductory language on capital budget guidelines. It's the penultimate sentence of that paragraph, capping capital cost to $42 million. If you are in favor of this amendment, please vote yes. If you are opposed, please vote no. Ms. Vasiliotis.
Yes.
Mr. Turner,
No.
Ms. Tarkington,
Yes.
Mr. Raymer,
No.
Ms. Crumick,
No.
Ms. Moriarty,
No.
Mr. Mason,
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Yes.
and I'm also a no. That motion has failed, 6-6. Ms. Hess called my name out first while I was still writing notes. Ms. Hess.
I'd actually like to go back to what we were discussing before, paragraph 3, the staffing. I think Ms. Fasciolis brought up a good point, and so I'd like to bring a motion that.
Need to use the mic.
Can you use the mic?
I apologize. That in paragraph 2 for staffing focus, I believe we need to change it to 75% of the town's and Board of Ed budget. And I believe that's really important because if you go back to the first paragraph in introduction, you describe the town departments separately from the Board of Ed. So in the first paragraph, you've actually distinguished between. So go back to staffing, page 5. Before we were talking about, it's a motion. Well, no, but I'm gonna add a new one because I know I anticipate that there's a bundling coming. So before we do that, I want to make a motion, which is a new one that you don't have in front of you, but it's in response to something that Ms. Fasciolis has said before. So we before talked.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
So this is a motion to clarify what's covered in response to Ms. Moriarty's comments from before. Is that correct?
No, this one is really to cover what Karen had said earlier. So we voted on paragraph 3, Board of Ed staffing, on page 5, which was proposal number, was it 10? It was 10, and that failed. What I'm saying, though, is Ms. Fasciolis pointed out that in the paragraph 2 above it was staffing focus, and that when it talked about so Ms. Moriarty suggested that that was captured as part of paragraph 2, but I think as Ms. Fasciolis pointed out, town does not include the Board of Ed. If you go back to the first page of the guidelines, it specifically defines sort of TOG or town separately from the Board of Ed. So I would like to make a clarification and propose an amendment in paragraph 2, staffing focus, paragraph on page 5, that we say the town and Board of Ed budget. And I think that addresses both Ms. Moriarty's point as well as Ms. Fasciolis' point, and then I think it takes the kind of ambiguity out of it.
I'll second.
So we have a motion by Ms. Hess, seconded by Ms. Moriarty, to add on page 5, paragraph 2, 2 words in the first line, so that this sentence would read, given that staffing costs represent over 75% of the town's and Board of Ed's budget.
Yeah, and then say all departments.
All departments must continually examine, and then to continue. So we're adding, and BOE's budget. Is that correct? Leslie and Deborah?
Yes.
Okay. That motion has been made and seconded. Discussion. Ms. Moriarty.
Okay, I'm just checking the numbers to see what the Board of Eds, I think, is slightly higher than the towns, but it's close enough. I will support this change. I think it's in the spirit of what we had talked about and what I think the intent of the guidelines were at the Budget Committee. I don't know if you're allowed to, but I would, if we want to also clarify number 3 to say Board of Ed certified staffing, so that that specific comment is targeted for
Yes.
certified, I would support that as well.
So I can modify my
So you can,
I can amend mine, right? So we would say and Board of Ed in paragraph 2, and in paragraph 3, we would insert, it would say Board of Ed certified staffing.
And it's in the body of paragraph 3 now.
so you're
Put it in
changing
the-
the second sentence to read changes in Board of Ed certified staff level?
Just in the title.
Just the
Oh, in the
title.
title,
Just the title.
Board of Ed certified staff. Okay, and Leslie, that you second that?
I second that as well.
Okay, so we have a motion to add and Board of Ed, Board of BOE apostrophe S, the first line of paragraph 2, and to add the word certified, the header, paragraph 3, moved by Ms. Hess, seconded by Ms. Moriarty. Further discussion? general voice vote on this. This is a Scrivener. Mr. Raymer.
I would make a motion that we entertain the following items as a block vote. I believe we've dealt with 2 through 5, so I would suggest that we pick up 6. 7 is withdrawn. We pick up 8, 9, 10 has been disposed of. 11, 12, 13 is withdrawn. 14 is disposed of. 15 is disposed of. 16 is I beg your pardon. No, we pick up 15. 16 is withdrawn. 17 and 18. I would propose that we entertain them for a block consideration.
Can you give those numbers again?
Let me see if I can do it. I believe that we've disposed of, I'm sorry, so the ones that we're entertaining, I'll save the rest of the jabber. We're entertaining 6, 8, 9, 11, 12, 15, 17, and 18. If I've done that incorrectly, I would welcome a correction.
Okay, we have a motion from Mr. Raymer to take up as a combined block the paragraphs on the handout that he referenced. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Weisbrod. Discussion. Okay. I'm going to take a name vote, so Raymer, Weisbrod, on that motion, and this is a motion on just whether to take them up as a block. And any discussion on the,
We have a minute just to look at.
yes, they requested a minute to look at the motions. So are you, you're proposing, well, you're putting them all on the floor, so now would be the time as well to have a substantive discussion.
Yeah, it's only
There's been
on the
no-
floor if the motion is approved. It's not on the floor yet.
Well, you're moving all of those items, right?
It's been seconded, and it's not a motion to entertain the substance yet. It's a motion of whether to consider them as a block.
Okay.
And so it's appropriate for discussion
Okay.
of whether we should consider them as a block, not yet appropriate to consider the merits of the
Okay.
individual items.
Okay, so this is, the motion is specifically whether to consider as a block, not on the merits.
Correct.
That's, you need still
Yeah.
a little more time?
Because
Okay.
Beth wants to see if there's one that she wants to pull out and discuss individually. Sorry, Beth.
Ms. Oberlander?
Mr. Mason?
In many years of guidelines, I've seen multiple drafts in front of us on the same meeting. I've never seen such a well-done effort to pick the item, redline it, give it to you as a separate item, broken up as a separate item in order to not be, quote, drafting on the fly, so people had it in front of them. I said before, I think combining the items and voting on them as that, I think the votes are there for that motion to pass. I think in its form, it is a form of limiting debate, even though all the items are available for discussion right now. I want to make it very clear what I think is happening here, and it has not been done like that before on this board.
Well, Mr. Mason, thank you for expressing your views. I would like to suggest to all members that all committee meetings for which you have a calendar are open to all members, and I would encourage you to either take part or find out what happened, communicate your views to your colleagues. We are all open and receptive to having a substantive dialogue. I will say that while I do appreciate receiving at least a draft to reference, receiving it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon as we're heading into a series of other meetings shows I have recognized that you didn't vote on the guidelines until yesterday morning. However, they have been circulated for 6 weeks, and there is certainly, I was not contacted by any member to try to encourage me to vote in accordance with these points of view. So I actually, just speaking personally, find it slightly disingenuous to say that that this was a well thought out process, and arguably I think it actually does a disservice to colleagues to present it like this. I am disappointed that that members did not communicate through the committee process and structure that we have in place, and I will take recommendations if you don't think the committee structure is working, to perhaps we refer that to the policy committee to take a look at how our committees work. Are you done? We're not taking comments on this, but Beth, are you ready? Okay, so I'm going to call for a vote on the motion that's on the floor, which is a block vote, moved by Mr. Raymer.
To take up as a
To take up as a block, excuse me, moved by Mr. Raymer, seconded by Mr. Weisbrod. Take up as a block items identified under paragraph 6, 8, 9, 11, 12, 15, 17, and 18. I will start with Ms. Vasiliotis. If you are in favor, please vote yes. If you are opposed, please vote no.
No.
Mr. Turner?
Aye.
Ms. Tarkington?
No.
Mr. Raymer?
Yes.
Ms. Crumick?
yes.
Ms. Moriarty?
Yes.
Mr. Mason?
No.
Yes.
No.
No.
Okay, and I am also a yes. So we have a 6-6 vote. I'm going to exercise my right as chair to pass a tie-breaking vote in favor of a block vote. I would like to suggest that we now take up these items for substance, and everyone has an opportunity to comment on substance, and seeing how long our discussions are going, they may even get to Ms. Hess when she gets back.
I was going to move those items. I'm not sure that the chair didn't already just do that.
No, I'll let you move them, right?
I would move those items for consideration by the board. Requires a second.
Oh, who seconded?
Mr.
Tony.
Turner.
All right, so the substantive consideration has been moved by Mr. Raymer, seconded by Mr. Turner. Do either one of you have something you want to say about?
No, but I would gladly defer to a member of the Republican caucus who might like to speak to those remaining items.
Is there any discussion on these
I would
items?
defer to any member who would like to speak to those items.
Okay. Okay, does anyone want to speak to the substance of those items? Okay. So, does anyone know whether Ms. Hess left for good, or whether she's
I think just went to the ladies' room.
returning? All right,
Why don't we just pause for a moment?
yes, I'll pause. We'll take a seventh inning stretch, as it were. We still have a couple of items.
I didn't realize when I saw the candies that were going to be here at Halloween.
You don't have to be.
Thank you, Kathy. I think until tomorrow when I weigh in.
Why did we carve out those three items? Because they're a little more substance. One had a budget cap,
But we knew we were going to vote it down. But we knew we were going to vote it down.
But they wanted to have a chance to have it separately considered and discussed. Leslie actually looked at it and thought, in fairness, they justify a separate conversation.
Okay.
I'm not sure of the others, but for sure Leslie Tarkington's changed about let's have a cap on capital at 42 million, which is a very low number for this particular year. Is worthy of perhaps separate comments. That's all right. I mean, I wouldn't have made that motion, but she wanted to. We really will leave here at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have a motion to take up the amendments. Thank you. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Good. Thank you. They can't see how much candy we eat.
Yeah. Let me get rid of all these wraps.
That's right.
That's a fire hazard on this.
Okay.
And I've got nowhere to sit.
All right, I'd like to take up a motion. We are voting on the motion, the proposed amendments identified in paragraph 6, 8, 9, 11, 12, 15, 17, and 18. There has been no comment made on the substance of those amendments. I will start. If you are voting yes, that means you are in favor of the amendments.
I'm sorry, I stepped out for a second.
Yes, you did. We waited for you for the vote.
I know we did, so may I?
Yes, you may.
Okay, so on Amendment 15, new project, so under capital budget guidelines, page 6, new projects, paragraph 2. The proposal there, I think some of the themes that keep coming up over and over, there's a substantial amount of open appropriations. I appreciate that we're going to ask about more information in this next budget cycle about understanding it when it's going to happen. But there is a lot of open projects, and given the fact that there is this large number that's sort of out there from last year, I get that. I think it's helpful just to clarify for the departments that we really would like to understand kind of a little bit more about these capital projects, what they're expecting to get out of it. It might be as simple as, it's time for this building, it's maintenance, and it's time that this needs to be done. But I think what we're trying to do is really understand with a little bit more clarity and try to prioritize these projects, which also sort of ties into the same page, item number 4, Board of Ed master plan. I think this is very, just in line with that. It's just in terms of what's the need, what's the expected outcome, and kind of when they think this will happen. So again, it's just a little bit more clarity on the capital projects that the departments will be requesting, especially in light of the fact that there's so much open appropriation that exists right now.
Thank you. Okay, any further comments? Ms. Moriarty?
Just to quickly respond, item number 6 on page 7 has a sentence in here, the BET is requesting greater detail on the rationale and scope of the project and detail on the timing. There's a lot more in there. I do expect to have a more full discussion about capital projects during our budget meetings, and I think there's an opportunity for us to communicate that to the departments as they come in. So I think we'll get that information. I think asking it, certainly making the change now, I'm not going to support, but when the way even this is phrased, it's not really actionable. It's basically saying asking the projects, the requesting entity to only put in projects that they think have an impact on the town. And if I were looking at this negatively, you turn that around and you're kind of asking the departments, have they been putting in projects that aren't required for the town? So as worded, I don't think it even gets to what you really want, certainly not in a positive way for the department to be able to respond to. But I think we'll get the information. I don't think we need to make that change in the document for tonight.
Any further comments? Okay. So I will call for a name vote. If you are voting yes, that means you would like to see those amendments go forward. If you are voting no, that means that you are voting to not include those amendments in the document. So, again, this is a combined vote on items identified as 6, 8, 9, 11, 12, 15, 17, and 18. Mr. Deuce.
Yes.
Ms. Hess.
Yes.
Mr. Weisbrod.
No.
Yes.
Mr. Mason. You're abstaining?
There's Scrivener errors in there that I'm not going to vote for, that need to be cleaned up, but we don't want to do that because we're voting in a block, so I'm abstaining.
Okay. Ms. Moriarty.
No.
Okay. Ms. Crumick.
No.
No.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And I am also a no. That motion has failed 5-6-1. Okay. Are there any additional amendments to be made to the budget guidelines?
I would move there, there's a motion on the floor then.
There's a motion on the floor to adopt the budget guidelines as amended this evening. Is there any discussion on the budget document, the guideline document as a whole? Ms. Tarkington.
So I am disappointed that until the last vote, that all the votes this evening were on a party basis. I had hoped on the two that I had moved, both the lowering the range to 2% and putting some kind of cap on the capital, which would have allowed us to lower the capital in the spreadsheet, the worksheet. So I'm disappointed in that. I did express my, we'll call it, concern that we didn't address these things in the Budget Committee and abstained at that point in my vote. I certainly think we all need to work together as we proceed with this budget this February, and as we anticipate it in January and February. So I will be supporting the budget in this vote, and hope that my colleagues will also work to, if they weren't willing to make these changes in this budget, but will work towards these goals as we move towards February, as I will be working on the Budget Committee to achieve these things and working with them to do a great budget for the town of Greenwich, and at the lowest mill rate that delivers the kind of services that our residents want, and that they can afford in today's environment.
Any further?
Who's making the motion?
The motion, it was already moved. The budget, Leslie moved, and Leslie Moriarty moved, and Leslie Tarkington seconded. There have been a couple of amendments that were approved. Mr. Mason.
I just hope before we send this document out, we fix the grammatical corrections in items 9 and items 9, items 12. I hope we fix those before we send this document out. Those were part of our would-have-been motions. They wouldn't have got supported as a group motion, but those were Scrivener corrections, but we didn't, it was obvious that the debate was trying to be pushed to voting for all the items together. I would thought that there would have been votes for grammatical corrections would have been there, but I hope we correct that before this document goes out.
Mr. Raymer.
I'm a little annoyed. I've now heard the remark in a simpering way 2 or 3 times, and I've said nothing, and now I'm going to say something. I've been on this board long enough that I have been told several times that we don't do wordsmithing as a board, and wordsmithing is out of order. I won't entertain those motions, let alone entertaining them one by one or line by line or in several pieces. Wordsmithing as a general matter is not done at a full BET, let alone with a memorandum that we receive just a few hours before we sit down here for the first time. I would gladly entertain, and you had gladly had an opportunity to entertain.
Speaking directly to me or through the chair, I want to get that.
You're right. I should not speak to an individual member. Let me change the syntax of the sentence. There's certainly opportunity. There still is opportunity, I suppose, to deal with a grammatical error. Nobody wants to publish a piece with grammatical errors. If it wasn't raised, I guess that's a misfortune that it encourages to go forward with it with a grammatical error. But I think it's good that we now stop hearing about how somebody may be feeling disadvantaged that they didn't have an opportunity to do line-by-line wordsmithing for at least 3 hours of time of this volunteer board.
Okay, I have some comments that I actually had written that I'm going to share now because I think it's actually applicable to us as well. These budget guidelines that we're about to vote on set the expectation level for the town and the Board of Education. I think we all recognize that this government is made up of a number of independent organizations and arguably independent individuals. And as a result, it may be easy to point to another unit as an example of where something can be improved. But I suggest that our constituents, the taxpayers, do not see town government in that way. And in fact, they don't see this board in that way. They see one Greenwich, and it therefore behooves all of us to work collaboratively to reach acceptable service and funding levels. Such collaboration may necessitate a closer look at the possibility of combined service functions, and it also challenges departments to think about how they can work across departments to provide services better, more efficiently, with transparency, and with increased accountability. It's true of our board as well. We need to work collaboratively across the aisle, maybe not efficiently, but perhaps with greater consideration for one another. On the department side, we already see that collaboration happening. One example being the joint BET Board of Education review of capital project procedures that we're going to take up next. And I commend the many town employees and board members who are working to make this a reality. I want to emphasize that these guidelines highlight a high priority expectation for the February budget hearings, informed by all the discussions we had this evening, as well as the 6 weeks of discussions that the Budget Committee had as well. Departments should prepare for in-depth discussions on service priorities and possible efficiencies or reductions needed to manage town costs. We want to be able to evaluate both the impact of existing programs as well as the real impact of service reductions if needed, i.e. the number of residents impacted and how. I want to thank all of you for doing the foundation work and thank our town departments for working so hard to make the February meetings productive. Bill, I saw that you had your hand up if you wanted to say something. Mike, did you want to speak?
Those are very, very nice words. I came in here tonight ready to vote in favor of guidelines. I'm still voting in favor of guidelines. What I heard, though, tonight is what I said. I've heard comments tonight. I've heard the word irresponsible. I've heard what headwinds cause or not. I've heard the word disingenuous tonight. And I've seen members speak out of order several times. The guidelines are very important. There was a point in time the town didn't even have them. And since they were invented, they have been revolutionary. I would be the first one to tell you, and I will tell one of my colleagues sitting next to me. I said when I came in, you've done yeoman's work. It's going to be very difficult to make these guidelines for the department heads. It really is. I mean, it's a challenging year, and in our executive session, we even had some other conversations about expenses. I hope we do support these guidelines, but I also hope we follow them. I hope we do that. The concerns raised tonight, I think, are valid concerns. I said earlier on that We had these guidelines a few days before our September meeting. I know how busy some of us are, especially in some of the assignments we have just on this board alone, forget other things. We had a special meeting. I think everybody's intent was there. I think that the format, there wasn't much of a choice. We usually don't even have audit committees before we have caucuses. We normally, the day of our full BET meeting, we normally have extra time for caucuses if need be. We weren't even prized with that luxury today because we had an audit committee meeting because of other issues going on. So my pride in this board is that everybody gets to have their input. As I said earlier, some members, even in the budget committee, I was specific. I said some other members are going to have some interesting points of view. I'm focusing on the mathematics, but on the impacts to our town. I think these are all vital concerns. But I can't change the clock. I can't change the schedule. I'm not worried about the time. When I come to these meetings, I'm here to conduct the business of the town. These are going to be difficult guidelines. I think there's been a lot of compromise on there, and I think going forward, I hope we all support them, but I hope we honor them too. And I thank you very much.
Ms. Vasiliotis.
I, for one, would echo what Mike said, but I would also say that I am also disappointed. I've heard the words rhetoric, I've heard the words disingenuous, and, quite frankly, just so you understand the process of the Republican caucus, we do provide input to our BET Budget Committee members, but we didn't have the opportunity to see the final draft and the real final draft until literally yesterday. So the comments that were forwarded at 4 p.m. were intended to clarify, to include things that we felt were important, and that's why we brought them here today, and we did not bring them in earlier. This is my first term on the board. I'm a little discouraged with the budget. This is my first budget guidelines letter. I think we have room for improvement, and I certainly will be offering some suggestions. I do intend to support this. I think that we could have improved them greatly. I'm disappointed that we didn't, but we will move forward.
Ms. Moriarty.
I know that everyone takes this document seriously and the budget process seriously. I think as far as process goes, the document before us is already kind of a negotiated agreement. That happens at the budget committee. It happens with comments from individuals between them. Every comment that was suggested during that process was considered, and I can tell you, even the document we got at 4 o'clock were considered. So I think when we talk about this final product, it's a negotiated document. It represents the gist and the direction that it sounds like we're all going in. We'll find out with the vote. The real work happens in February. This just sets the stage. We do have several other opportunities to influence what that final budget is. But I think on most of the substantive issues, I think we've reached a general agreement, and I just appreciate hearing everyone's concern. There's no perfect process out there, but it was intended to be as open as it can be, given the constraints of meetings and time schedules and availability. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to call for a name vote on the budget guidelines as amended this evening. I'm going to start with Mr. Deuce.
Yes.
Ms. Hess.
Yes.
Mr. Weisbrod.
Yes.
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 I've got to put this in the order that we said. Ms.
Yes.
Crumick.
Yes.
Yes.
Starkington.
Yes.
And I'm also a yes, so that the budget guidelines have passed by a 12-0 vote. Thank you all for your cooperation, and we will move forward to the next item on our agenda. Before we move to the next item on our agenda, does anyone else need to take a break before No? Okay. So the next item on our agenda is the Board of Ed capital review, shorthand, I suppose, for review of capital processes at the Board of Ed. As you all may recall, at the September BET meeting, after extensive discussion, the BET approved the following resolution: to authorize the internal auditor and the BET liaisons to the Board of Ed to develop a plan to evaluate the processes for capital improvement budgeting and maintenance processes at the Board of Ed and report such plan to the BET. This plan will recommend an action plan and will be developed and executed with the BOE. And I will note, not in my notes, that this was a well-negotiated resolution, actually, on the floor of the BET. Over the past month, education liaisons Leslie Moriarty and Deborah Hess met several times internally and with members of the Greenwich Public Schools Administration to develop this proposed action plan. You have all received a draft of this plan. The liaisons have also presented this plan to the Law, Budget, and Audit Committees at their respective meetings this month. School Superintendent Ralph Mayo, Chief Operating Officer Lorianne O'Donnell, and Board of Education Chair Peter Bernstein all attended the Audit Committee meeting last week to ensure open communication and collaboration between the Board of Ed and the BET. Based on the foregoing, the two initial requests of the education liaisons have been satisfied. I'm going to ask Ms. Moriarty and Ms. Hess to please provide a brief summary of the plan and recommended next steps. Ms. Moriarty.
So Ms. Hess and I spent several, not full days together, but we met several times with each other, with the public school administration, with the internal auditor, and with the town budget director, all to solicit comments on what the scope of this project needs to be. The scope meets the needs of the motion passed by the BET. It focuses on the processes within the Board of Ed and within the town for approval and completion of work. That covers finance, P&Z, insurance, legal, purchasing. We're looking at it all. We want to have the systems and the timelines to support those projects looked at, as well as the staffing and the technology levels to support the work. The focus is to understand what is in place and what are the deficiencies for what the systems we have, and then to make recommendations for improvement. This, as Ms. Oberlander indicated, this was reviewed with the BET committees, Law, Budget, and Audit, and the Audit Committee, I believe, will have a report on its recommendations. There were two unresolved items that we had, but I believe the Audit Committee has a recommendation of how to move forward with the project scope. The Board of Education has already moved to hire the firm Bloom Shapiro to deal with its focus, which was a little bit more just on the financial tracking and control systems. We're expanding it to look at the complete process to see how the complete process can be modified to meet all of our needs. So we were able to solicit an additional scope of work from Bloom and Shapiro so we can leverage the work that they're doing as far as background research, and to work, again, collaboratively with the Board of Ed, looking at this entire scope of work. They came forward with a financial cost to add to the scope of work that I believe the Audit Committee will also have a recommendation about.
Ms. Hess, would you like to add anything?
Not at this time.
Mr. Weisbrod, would you like to report on the Audit Committee actions?
So I have to say that we had the most wonderful and collaborative sessions at the Audit Committee. It was one of the most heartening things I've done since I've been on this BET. We met together. We had an engagement with the Board of Ed, and we, really reviewed what was being proposed first by the Board of Ed and what we were proposing through the work that the liaison, Deborah and Leslie, did. And so out of that, we passed a motion today, 4-0 at the Audit Committee, which is as follows. And I'm reading from what Jill has already circulated to the whole BET. It's to move to authorize expenditure of an amount not to exceed $25,000 to supplement the funds allocated by the Board of Ed in relation to the Blum-Shapiro contract and to be used for the purpose of completing the additional scope of work outlined in the plan submitted by the education liaisons. This work to be supplemented by the engagement of the town's internal auditor under the direction of the Audit Committee. And so that's the motion that we approved, and I think it represents a good path forward and collaborative work by not only us on the Audit Committee, but by the Board of Ed. And so I was very pleased by that and very happy to be part of it.
Ms. Hess.
So just a few things to add. I agree, it was very collaborative in terms of working with the Board of Ed. And I think that we came up with a plan that is a single plan that's a full scope review of the processes, not only the financial side, as the Board of Ed was primarily focused on, but also the full process from the kind of when you start to think about in a capital appropriation to once it's appropriated, how you manage it. And then I think a very important part being the oversight and the reporting and working with finance and the rest of the town. So I'm very pleased with all of that. I just to add on to something that Leslie did say, there were a couple of open items that, where we've left it is it's going to be a future item at the Audit Committee. And those two items were, one, we talked about it, we can call it a look back, we can talk it an audit, but whatever you want to call it. But just going back and looking at some of the prior capital projects just to make sure that what we believe happened actually did in fact happen. And I think the importance of that was we've spent tens of millions of dollars, putting aside the building committees, right, because that wasn't part of the scope here, but we spent a lot of money on Board of Ed capital projects. And I do think that it's, taxpayers have a right to know, did we complete or substantially complete what we thought we did when we appropriated that money. And then the other one is just there's this big master plan that's being talked about, and at some point just getting ourselves comfortable with the sort of integrity around that plan and the completeness versus maybe other projects that had happened what we thought had happened and the scheduling. So those two items remain as an open item to be taken up for future Audit Committee meeting. So I just wanted to say, while I'm very happy with the way this went, I'm very supportive of this process, and adding on our scope, which I thought was more fulsome than what the Board of Ed was planning to do. I am disappointed that at this point we're not going to do a look-back audit, but I think that by the work that Bloom-Shapiro will do, there will be a review of some amount of transactions, which we're still determining what that number is, and we'll find out kind of what the results of those observations are, and we can react accordingly at the time. So, thank you.
I'd like to say one more constructive thought. First of all, I agree with Ms. Hess totally, but because of the input from Ms. Hess in particular, we did incorporate the notion that to understand these processes, it was not sufficient to look purely at the Julian Curtis. It was also important to look at other processes to understand how they worked in terms of any lessons learned and ways that we could improve the linkage, if you will, between the capital process at the Board of Ed and the town. And so thanks to Ms. Hess and that initiative, that's been incorporated in the existing Blum-Shapiro project plan, and the additional cost that we've just indicated, the $25,000, for the most part is really going to be to fund those assessments of other projects. And so a good example of collaborativeness and engagement by everybody who was involved.
Mr. Mason.
There's one thing I haven't heard mentioned, that I think that the scope of the work and the product will be Board of Ed and the Audit Committee with liaisons combined. Is that correct? Am I hearing it?
Yes.
Okay. So, as you know, last month we talked about a look back, and I think if we're going to embark on this, especially since we're spending taxpayer money, I'd like to read a paragraph from our last month's minutes. they're not approved yet, they're still subject to approved, and after this, they might be edited, but it says BET members discussed the estimated number of projects executed by the Board of Ed during the 6-year period that would be included in the condition survey report required by the resolution. Members considered the length of time, labor, and cost, and the proposed look-back analysis and the possibility of reducing the size and sample of the projects. Mr. Bernstein and Dr. Mayo, and I'm not sure doctor is a doctor.
He's not, he's Mr.
I think he's a mister. Okay. But we can elevate him to that. I don't think he would. It says, I'll read it to be exact. Dr. Mayo cautioned that the changes in personnel and a lack of standardized process and the quality of the record keeping could diminish the value of the proposed report, recognizing that a more limited look back had value to improve practices and processes before the master facilities capital program is commenced. So we'll just take that as I hear it for a future agenda, but future agendas, today's here, and I'm going to stand my position that a look-back process, whether it be a small step or a full-blown run, something has to be initiated on that, because we have the chair of the Board of Ed and the superintendent of schools saying that we need to do some of this. So I think if it's a future meeting agenda, I wish it was on tonight's meeting agenda and we'd done it. So that's my position on this.
Okay. Mr. Weisbrod, are you making the audit committee motion for the
Yes.
full BET?
Having just read the audit committee motion, I would ask that I don't have to read it again, and I move that we approve that motion.
Okay. Seconded by Mr. Deuce. Okay, so the audit committee motion and has been moved by Mr. Weisbrod, seconded by Mr. Deuce. I will just explain that the question came up as to whether it's necessary that the BET take up this motion. I thought, given the conversation last month and the interest that was expressed over the last couple months in this process, that to close the loop, we should definitely vote on this. Mr. Mynarski, as controller, has the authority to remit these funds, but I think an express authority on behalf of the BET is prudent. Is there discussion on that motion? Further discussion on that motion? Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to call for a voice vote with hands raised. All in favor of the motion proposed by Mr. Weisbrod, seconded by Mr. Deuce, please say aye. And raise your hand. Any opposed? Any abstentions? That motion has carried 12-0. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. And to respond to Mr. Mason, yes, the audit committee did put that issue on the audit committee agenda with the request that it be included on the next audit committee agenda. So it's not being put off to some point in the future. Long in the future. Then the next item on our agenda is the Neuberger-Berman custodial agreement that was touched upon earlier in the evening in the report from the Investment Advisory Committee Chair David Weisbrod. I'd like to note that this topic has been given significant scrutiny by members of the Retirement Board, the BET, town employees, and outside advisors. And I'd like to thank everyone for their participation in this process. But despite this attention, questions still remain about some of the business terms and legal agreements. As mentioned by Mr. Weisbrod, the Retirement Board Chair, Joe Pellegrino, stated this morning that he wants BET members to have the opportunity to have all their questions answered before the item is put to a vote. And I thank Mr. Pellegrino for this consideration and leeway. Mr. Weisbrod, do you have a motion on this? To continue this until the next
Oh, yeah. So I'm just looking at some other notes. And I know it's late, but I do want to schedule this workshop that we talked about to accommodate the calendars, especially of those who have not had an opportunity to be at previous sessions of the Investment Advisory Committee. And so we will start by soliciting, among a few of you in particular, to make sure that we can coordinate the schedules. And we would plan on having Neuberger Berman attend, as well as the outside counsel, Ted Smoot. So it would be, and we'll block out a couple of hours to do it. Having said that, I move that we defer the vote on the sub-custody arrangement via Neuberger until the following BET meeting.
Which is the 19th of November.
I think you meant
Ms.
a
Crum.
motion to continue?
A motion to continue.
A motion to continue. I'm sorry, it's the hour is late, and so I apologize. Motion to continue.
Okay, and is there a second for that motion?
Second.
Seconded, a motion to continue for the Neuberger Berman item, made by Mr. Weisbrod, seconded by Mr. Raymer.
Mr. Turner.
Mr. Turner, excuse me, Mr. Turner. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye and raise your hands. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? That item has carried 12-0. Okay, that concludes the new business items, which leaves me to a very brief chair's report. Very brief. On Good and Welfare, Deborah Hess and I had the opportunity to participate in fire operations training. And true to our personalities, Deborah is the one to confront risk head-on, and I'm the one to sit back and evaluate risk from the sidelines. We were well taken care of by our Greenwich firefighters, and we had a great day participating. Luckily, it did not rain. Because I was much happier on the outside than I was on the inside, and it was nice that it was sunny. I would give a little bit more details, but the hour is late. Deborah, do you want to add anything? I would just thank all participants and the Greenwich Fire Department for providing us with that training.
Yeah, no, I would just add, I think they really wanted us to experience, some of the things that they go through as firefighters, and I was surprised by, some of the drills that we did, but it was definitely a good learning experience.
The second item on my chair's report, actually, I'm going to add a third. The debt and fund balance working group meetings have been scheduled, and Ms. Moriarty has forwarded all of you the dates for the committee meetings. I do encourage you all to attend and to participate fully. You've heard tonight that all comments from BET members and questions are welcome, and it is important that each one of us owns our education and our participation, and I do encourage you to either reach out to your committee members if you can't attend to get an update, or to do your best to attend or ask for an update as well. To respond to some of the comments made this evening, I would ask that our Policy and Procedures Committee reach out to members and ask if there's a way to improve our process so that membership can feel that the committee process is working more effectively for them. We certainly want to make sure that all comments are all members have the opportunity during the process to provide their comments, as well as the sense that their comments are heard and responded to. And if there's a deficiency in our process, I think that's something that it's incumbent upon us to address. So I ask our Policy and Procedures Committee to take that up over the next few weeks as well. The last item on our agenda is the approval of the BET meeting minutes. You've all received draft minutes from, I didn't change, the September meeting. Are there any proposed changes to these minutes? Okay. So we have a motion to approve the minutes made by Ms. Tarkington, seconded by Mr. Raymer. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Oh, wait,
sorry.
one comment from Ms. Crumick, Clerk of the Court first.
Just going to pick up Mr. Mason's,
Clerk of the BET.
noting that it's Mr. Mayo, and I will reflect that in the final
Okay, thank you.
minutes.
Thank you. All in favor of adopting the minutes edited by Scribner's corrections, please say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, that 12-0 in favor? Okay, and now,
I move that we adjourn.
Mr. Weisbrod
Second,
and Ms. Vasiliotis seconded.
since he beat me to it.